Hello everyone, if you're new to my channel, consider liking and subscribing. It will make me feel wonderful if you do that. Thanks. By the way, I also have another Naruto and Luffy fanfiction channel. If you are interested, link is in the description.
King of the Pirates by Alex0404. After eating a powerful logia devil fruit as a child, Luffy sets out to fulfill his dream of being the Pirate King. To fulfill his dream, he will gather a crew filled with fellow dreamers and conquer the Grand Line. The warlord of my channel are Zach Travis, Garrick Russell, Ben Brownlee, Case Clark, Tristan Ward, KSGPL4YZ, Brian McKenzie. Join the channel membership if you would like to support the channel.
The East Blue the crew had taken refuge in the ship's dining area as they sailed towards the entrance of the Grand Line in order to ride out the worst of the storm. "So you gonna tell us what she's doing here?" Nami asked Luffy while giving him the stink eye. Either not picking up on Nami's mood or simply not caring, Luffy smiled at her. "She's part of the crew." Hearing this, Sanji perked up and gave Luffy an award-winning smile. "Nice job, Captain." This crew was starting to turn into a bit of a sausage fest. Then, getting down on one knee in front of Alvida, he gently took her hand and attempted to kiss her knuckles just like he had seen Luffy do. Alvida, however, refused to have any of this as she had her sights set on Luffy, as he was the only man that had ever been strong enough to stand up to her. From out of nowhere, Alvida pulled out her iron mace and brought it down on Sanji's head. The other male members of the crew snickered at seeing Sanji brained while Nami stared at Luffy stonily. "So how do we get to the Grand Line, Captain?" Zoro asked, still smirking at an unconscious Sanji. "Nami, did you happen?" Without a word, Nami reached into one of her bags of purchases she got in Logatown and pulled out a map, spreading it out on the table. After examining the map for a moment, Nami became confused. "This map must be wrong. The trail to the Grand Line seems to take us up this mountain here." Everyone looked to see the mountain she was pointing at, and true to her words, there was a thin body of water that traveled up the mountain on the map. "No, that's right," Jin said, still looking at the map. Looking up, he saw nearly everyone staring at him in confusion while Luffy smiled. "You had to sail up Reverse Mountain. I dunno if that's the only way into the Grand Line, but it's how we got there with Don Krieg." But Nami was genuinely speechless. How on earth were they meant to sail up a mountain? It was just impossible. "Jin's right. The pirates I met when I was a kid told me tons of stories about the Grand Line, and a few of them were about Reverse Mountain," Luffy informed them, still smiling at their confusion. Why can't we just sail across this little bit here?" Johnny asked naively. "Nope, no can do," Luffy immediately responded. "And why not? I mean, Johnny's got a bit of a point. It'd be a lot easier to just sail across this tiny bit of ocean than it would trying to sail up a mountain," Usopp piped up from his spot at the end of the table next to Zoro. "Two reasons. The first is that that's the calm belt where there's no wind or sea current, so the entire sea is completely calm." Everyone around the table realized immediately what Luffy was getting at and knew that without some form of propulsion, the calm belt would be unsailable. Plus, the calm belt is where all the world's biggest sea kings live. But secondly, and this is more important, everyone leaned in close, believing they were about to be let in on a big secret. That'd be cheating. More than a few people rolled their eyes and sighed in exasperation at those words, but Luffy didn't let that deter him. "If we're gonna sail the Grand Line, I want us to do it properly. No shortcuts." The rest of the crew grumbled out an enthusiastic "Aye, Captain. Now we've got a bit of time before this storm breaks, so I've got something to bring to everyone's attention." With that said, Luffy left the room only to return a minute or so later holding a small chest in his hands. "I found this back in Kokoyashi, and after putting it somewhere safe I forgot about it." Seeing that he had everyone's attention, he made his way to the table before opening the chest to reveal the devil fruit inside. "Now I dunno what this devil fruit actually is. It could be something completely useless for all we know. But if any of you want it, you can have it." Out of the crew that we capable of eating a devil fruit, only Zoro and Nami flat out refused it. The rest all looked interested. "I know there's an encyclopedia or summit out there that's got pretty much every devil fruit listed in it. So unless any of you really want to eat it now, I reckon it'd be best to wait and see if we can get out hands on that book," Luffy said as he looked around at his crew, who were all mulling over his words. It only took a few moments for everyone to come to the consensus that it would be better to wait and see which devil fruit they actually had. Yeah, actually, I got everyone their clothes and I got the store to put your names on the bags that are yours," Nami said, waving behind her to the shopping bags. "What's in that huge bag at the end?" Zoro asked, bemused. "That's the bag with my clothes in it. Why, got a problem with that?" she asked, tilting her head back and jutting out her jaw in a challenge. Ever the peacekeeper that he was, it was Usopp that got between them before Zoro could say anything and dig his own grave a little more. No, not all, he was just wondering is all. Nami just hummed in disbelief. "I also got Usopp to pick a little something extra up." Usopp then got out the tools that had been on the shopping list Nami had given him when he ran into her back in Logia Town. "I thought we could all get our very own personal Jolly Rogers tattooed, but link them all together by putting a straw hat on them." Nami truly believed that it was a good idea, however when she actually said her idea out loud to the rest of the crew she started to have doubts. Nami's doubts however soon vanished when both Luffy and Zoro grinned at each other. She then passed them the paper with the designs that Usopp had come up with and they were well and truly blown away. Every design was a skull and crossbones with a straw hat, yet at the same time they were unique. Luffy's design was a standard Jolly Roger wearing a straw hat, but in place of the crossbones there were 2 lightning bolts. Zoro's was the same as Luffy's, except instead of lightning bolts he had 2 swords with a third one held between the skull's teeth. Nami's Jolly Roger was a winking skull and crossbones on top of the tattoo she currently had on her left shoulder. Sanji's was a skull wearing a straw hat with a swirly eyebrow on top of a knife and fork. Jin was a standard skull and crossbones, but it had 2 demonic-looking horns coming out of its head as a nod to his moniker. It was Usopp's that was the most amusing though, as it was a skull facing slightly to the side with a ridiculously long nose on top of 2 crossed pistols. Seeing the long nose, Luffy and Nami couldn't help but snicker, making Usopp pout slightly. "Why do me and Yozuku have 2 skull and crossbones on ours?" Johnny asked Usopp. "Never get one of you without the other, so you might as well be one person, so I thought we should show that in your mark." Hearing Usopp's explanation, Johnny and Yozuku looked at each for a moment before grinning and throwing an arm around each other's shoulders. I didn't know you were gonna be part of the crew, so I haven't done a design for you yet. Sorry," Usopp said to the newest addition to the Straw Hat Pirates. Alvida simply waved him off. "Don't worry about it. Tell you what, just use my old Jolly Roger and put a straw hat on it." Okay." Luffy could barely contain his excitement at this bonding experience. His crew truly was beginning to come together. "Let's get on with it already." Shouldn't we wake up Dart Brow and get his opinion?" Zoro asked, not really caring either way. "Yeah, I suppose. Jin, see if you can bring him around. Usopp, let's get started already." 3 hours later the crew's tattoos were all finished, with Jin completing Usopp's for him. Luffy was just admiring his on his right shoulder before inspiration struck him. "Hey Usopp, can you do me another one?" "I suppose. Why, what do you want? Can you tattoo the letters A, S, L on my chest right here?" Luffy asked, pointing to his chest right over his heart. "Seems simple enough." Just as Usopp was finishing Luffy's newest tattoo, Nami asked the question that was on everyone's mind. "So what's with the A, S and L?" "Mine and my brother's initials," said Ahe. Said that everyone shared a look, silently asking each other the same question. Did you know Luffy had any brothers? And it was at that moment that the entire crew realized that they didn't know that much about their own captain. After all, Luffy was the type of person that went out of his way to help them or asked about them, not the other way around. "Just one last thing, Usopp. I need you to put an X on top of the S for me." Okay, but you sure?" Usopp asked uncertainly. After all, tattoos were permanent, so he wouldn't be able to change his mind later. "Why do you want the S crossed out?" Nami asked curiously. That, however, was a question that Luffy ignored, as he simply pretended that he hadn't heard Nami speak. Zoro, however, was sat directly opposite him and saw the slight downturn of his lips when she asked that last question, and he realized that the brother whose name began with S was probably dead. With the tattoo done, Luffy got up to leave. "There's no sense in trying to sail any further in this storm tonight, so drop anchor and we'll pick it up again in the morning." Looking around at the nods he was receiving, he grinned. "Now I'm knackered, so I'm gonna go for a soak in the bath." Nami perked up at the word bath and fixed her gaze on him intently. "Bath? Why do you get a bath and I have to make do with a shower?" Luffy just pointed to himself dumbly with his index finger. "Captain," was all he said before he left the room to head back to his cabin. Nami however was coming up with various schemes and plots to use that bath. It had been weeks since she was able to have a nice long hot soak in the bath, and she'd be damned if she let anyone get in her way. Lying in bed later that night, Nami was unable to sleep. Sighing to herself, she got up to head to the kitchen only to stop when she saw the bag she had left on her desk. Realizing that she had yet to give Luffy the gift she had picked up in Logatown, she picked it up and headed towards his room, hoping that he was still awake. Knocking on his door, Nami waited patiently for Luffy to open the door. However, while she waited, she looked down and realized that she had forgotten to put on a dressing gown, leaving her in just her night clothes. But as she turned to return to her room to put something else on, Luffy answered the door. He looked at Nami, who was only dressed in a pair of short shorts and a small loose-fitting strappy top, and raised an eyebrow as he looked her up and down. Flushing in embarrassment, she gestured behind him silently, asking to enter. Not saying a word, Luffy stood to one side and allowed her to enter, closing the door behind her, and walked past her to lean against the desk in his cabin. "So, what do you want?" I got you this back in Logatown," Nami said, still a little bit embarrassed at her state of undress. She then handed him the antique pocket watch and saw him smile softly when he took it. "Thanks, Nami, it means a lot that you thought of me like this. I'll have to get Usopp to sort me out a chain for it so I don't lose it. I just saw it and thought of you," Nami said as she took a step closer to Luffy. "Nami, we can't. You're a member of my crew, it wouldn't be right," and as he said that, he stopped leaning against his desk and stood up straight. Undeterred, she took another slight step forwards. "Why not?" she asked. "I'm your captain and, well, I suppose it'd feel like I was taking advantage of you." Yet another slight step forwards took Nami only a foot away from him. "You make it sound like we're getting married or something." Seeing that Luffy was still unconvinced, she added, "We're both only human and we've both got needs, just look at it like that. It doesn't have to mean anything if we don't want it to." "And you don't want it to?" a disbelieving Luffy asked. "Problem for another day," that was all Nami said before she closed the now small gap between the two of them and kissed him. Despite the fact that he knew as her captain he shouldn't be doing this, the last time didn't count in his mind as she wasn't technically part of the crew. Luffy couldn't stop himself. The words of Shanks back when he was a kid had a big impact on his behavior towards the opposite sex, which had resulted in Luffy being a slight bit of a philanderer. Seeing that she was getting what she wanted, she inwardly smirked, "Hot take that, Najiko," and she began leading Luffy to his bed, never breaking the kiss. Luffy and Nami awoke the next morning in a slight tangle of limbs and a very loud knocking on Luffy's cabin door. The pair panicked slightly at not wanting what had happened to become the ship's gossip. "Oi, Captain, I know you're in there. Get your ass out here. The rain stopped and the winds died down a bit, so we should get going," Zoro yelled through the door. "Well, you're the first mate, so just check the heading and start sailing us towards Reverse Mountain." "No can do, Captain. When I went near the helm to do that, Usopp and Jin had a bit of a hissy fit and said they weren't letting me have anything to do with direction. Wankers. I can't find the Sea Witch anywhere, so that means you need to do it." "Fine. I'll be out soon." Hearing that Zoro was walking away, he looked down at Nami, who still had her head on his chest. "TCH, I was hoping for another round this morning." Nami smirked, suddenly having an idea. "Well, since you have to get up, I might as well make use of your bath." With that, she got up and headed to Luffy's bathroom, not even bothering to hide her modesty, and looking over her shoulder she said, "Just tell everyone you said I could use your bath last night and I came over earlier to have a soak. You never know, maybe next time you can join me," she said with a sultry smirk and a wink. Luffy just rolled his eyes as he began getting dressed, before he stopped and thought about things. "Hang on a minute, I've just realized I've slept with both sisters, ha go me." 3 days later, the crew was still sailing with the storm at their backs, but at least they had passed through the worst of it with only the raging winds still assaulting them. The crew had just finished Zoro's exhausting training regime when, from the crow's nest, Jin spotted a small fleet of marine ships blocking their path. "Captain, marine ships dead ahead. There's at least 10 ships blocking the way." Luffy took out his spyglass and looked for any identifying insignia on the flags or sails. "TCH, that's the mark of Commodore Nelson." "Is he strong?" an eager Zoro asked as he stepped up beside Luffy with Wado Ichimonji slung across his shoulder. "He's very fat. And sweaty." Luffy then began barking out orders to his crew. "I want those ships out of my way. Usopp, man the bow cannons. Johnny and Yozuku go with him and help him reload. Alvida head below deck and man the secondary bow cannon and take Jin with you to help reload. Nami man the helm and keep us steady and on course." Various ayes rang out from the crew when they received their orders, and they set about manning their positions while Luffy headed to Mary's figurehead. Facing the ships on the port side, he waited until Usopp fired, and when he did, Luffy clapped his hands together, forming a small ball of lightning between his palms. Then quickly he spread his arms wide, causing the ball of lightning to grow and fire at the ships. Both Usopp and Alvida had destroyed one ship each with their first shot and were reloading, while Luffy had taken out 3 ships with his devil fruit powers. Luffy turned to Zoro. "Go tell Alvida that when she fires the next shot, I wanted her back on deck and on the starboard cannons." Nodding, Zoro went below deck to relay the order. Usopp fired the next shot to get on the starboard cannons with Alvida. Luffy created a ball of lightning the size of a football before he launched it with the speed and precision of a world-class pitcher at the last remaining ship off the port side. After his last attack, he teleported beside Nami, startling her slightly. "Nami, I want you to bank hard to port. I want to hit them with our starboard broad guns." Nami didn't even bat an eye at Lu, implying without a word. Moments later, the sound of cannons rang out once more as each available crew member on the Mary fired a cannon each. 7 cannonballs flew towards the remaining 3 marine ships, sinking 2 and crippling a third. Before Usopp could reload another cannonball, Luffy called over to him, "Leave that ship be. Dead men tell no tales." The crew let out a collective sigh of relief at their victory. After all, it's not every day that a single pirate ship is capable of taking out 10 marine ships and crippling another one. "Nami, how far away are we from the entrance to the Grand Line?" At Luffy's question, Nami went to her cabin to examine her charts, returning only a few moments later. "Maybe another 3 days if the wind changes, but at the moment it's against us." "Well, nothing we can do about the wind, but if there's anyone in the world that can tell when the wind's about to change, it's you, Nami." "Oi Sanji, when's dinner? I'm starved." Sanji let out a lung full of smoke before speaking. "I can have something ready in about half an hour." It was the following day that Nami informed everyone that the wind was changing, which would shave a few days off their journey, and true to her word, it only took 4 days for them to reach the entrance to the Grand Line. With Usopp on watch from the crow's nest, the Straw Hats were able to locate the gate that the current flowed through as it traveled up Reverse Mountain. "Nami, get us in that current over there," Luffy called, pointing to spot off the starboard bow. Nami looked to see where Luffy was pointing as she adjusted the helm to take the Mary into the specific current. When the Mary got into a correct sea current, its speed increased dramatically, and Nami became unable to adjust the helm without risking snapping the rudder. The crew then got their first look at the gateway to the Grand Line, and while it was little more than 2 rectangular pillars that jutted out from the sea perfectly vertically, the crew looked at it with a feeling of awe. This was where their pirate adventure would truly begin. From his spot in the crow's nest, Usopp called down to Nami frantically, "Nami, we're about to hit the gate on the port side. There's nothing I can do, the current is too strong. If I do any more, the rudder's gonna give." Luffy was thinking quickly, needing to find a solution, otherwise they were going to crash, ending their journey before it even began. Looking around for inspiration, his eyes landed on the cannons, before glancing at the wall of Reverse Mountain and then back to the Mary. "Everyone man the port side cannons now. Don't load a cannonball. Just gunpowder, and when I give the signal, I want everyone to fire the cannons." "And what's that meant to do?" Nami shrieked, fear at their impending crash clear in her voice. "If we fire the cannons at the right moment, it'll give us the nudge we need to get the Mary through the gate." Hearing Luffy's reasoning and desperate to try anything to survive, every crew member save Nami, who was still manning the helm, manned a cannon. Staring intently at the approaching gate, Luffy waited for the perfect moment. Call it too late and it won't achieve anything and they'll crash, and if he was to call it too soon, then the current could push them off course again, meaning they'd still crash. "Fire!" Luffy bellowed. At his order, 8 cannons fired, which provided just enough force to nudge the bow of the ship more to starboard. Usopp and Yozuku fell to their knees in relief, while Sanji and Jin lit a cigarette to calm their nerves. It took a moment for the reality of the situation to fully sink in, but when it did, every Straw Hat let out a laugh as they darted to sides of the ship to see the ship sail up a mountain. Upwards the ship rocketed until they had even passed the clouds. The current took them even higher until they reached the plateau, where they splashed down in the small lake at the summit, droplets of water flying up and freezing due to the altitude, making them look like diamonds. Everyone marveled at the beauty of the summit, though without warning the current once more took control of the ship, forcing it to turn before it shot forwards, flying down the side of the mountain, causing the Straw Hats to scream in terror. However, when they got further down the mountain, the slop began to level out bit by bit, slowing their speed gradually. Captain, there's another mountain in front of us," pointed out Usopp from his spot at the front of the ship. Looking to where Usopp was pointing, Luffy's words seemed to accurately sum up what everyone else was thinking. "Well, shit, base of Reverse Mountain." "Captain, we're going way too fast, we're gonna crash," shouted several crew members hysterically. Thinking fast, Luffy turned to Usopp. "Usopp, I need you fire the bow cannon just like we did before to sail up the mountain. Nami, when Usopp fires, I want you to steer the ship around. Whatever the hell that is." "On it, Captain," and with that both Usopp and Nami set about their tasks. Luffy's idea bore fruit. Firing the cannon did provide enough stopping power to slow the ship slightly, which was enough for Nami to be able to steer the ship around the small mountain. "What on earth is that thing? It wasn't here the last time." Jin asked nobody in particular and not truly expecting any kind of factual response. As the Mary sailed around the giant mass, the entire crew stared at it, only to scream when an eye suddenly opened and looked straight at them. The crew's screaming garnered a reaction from the mass as a chasm opened vertically, drawing in water and therefore pulling the Mary into it. "It's a mouth. It's a goddamn mouth. Look over there, those aren't rocks, they're teeth." Usopp pointed out, to which several crew members looked closer and saw that Usopp was indeed correct. "You know, it kinda looks like a whale," Johnny pointed out as he scratched his head in confusion. "Does it matter what it is? We're about to be bloody eaten." "Luffy, do something," Nami screeched. She knew the Grand Line would be dangerous, but she never expected to be eaten within moments of arriving. "And what do you want me to I don't know, just do something, use your lightning thingy and zap it or something." "What, so when it sinks into the sea dead it can take us with it?" Luffy retorted angrily, his frustration at the situation mounting rapidly. Unfortunately, the Straw Hats never had an opportunity to take any action to save themselves from the grisly fate of being eaten by a giant whale, as they passed between two of the whale's teeth and it closed its mouth, trapping them in complete darkness. Then, just like on their journey up Reverse Mountain, they felt the shop beneath them shift slightly as they were pulled along a current. The next few moments were tense. Unable to see anything in the pitch darkness, they were helpless to do anything as the ship careered along some form of set path through the whale. Luffy would later admit that if it had been under better circumstances, then the ride would have been thrilling. However, not knowing whether they would live or die meant that the ride was just plain terrifying. Eventually they emerged from the darkness of the tunnel and into what, at first glance, seemed to be the open ocean. "Are we back outside?" Alvida asked, with one eyebrow arched delicately. The crew examined their surroundings, however it was Usopp, with his keen eyes, that spotted several discrepancies that put paid to that theory. "No, we can't be. Look up at the sky, nothing's moving. The clouds and birds are completely still. I think they're painted on, plus the sea's green." The other Straw Hats began taking note of the various things Usopp had pointed out, and a few began to worry about where they had ended up. "Do you think this is the whale's stomach? I mean, it did swallow us, didn't it?" Sanji asked between drags on his cigarette, his one visible eyebrow raised as he concentrated on his surroundings. "You ever heard of a whale having a sky painted in its stomach?" Zoro asked snidely. Luffy couldn't help but huff slightly in exasperation at the way those two bicker and fought like an old married couple. He genuinely didn't know whether they did it as a bit of banter between them, they truly didn't like each other, or if it was just unresolved sexual tension. Mentally shrugging when he realized he didn't actually care which it was as long as it didn't affect the running of his ship, Luffy returned to scanning the surroundings. "Hey, look over there," Alvida yelled from the bow of the ship, everyone moving to join her. "It's some kinda island, I think." Everyone grabbed all the oars they could manage and began the slow process of attempting to row the ship towards the small island. When they got closer, they noticed that on the small island was a well-made hut. It looked like a small holiday home that a senior citizen may own. Just as the Straw Hats were about to discuss what their next move should be, the door to the hut swung open and a fairly tall and well-built but very old man walked out wearing a bright shirt, shorts and sandals. However, the oddest thing about his appearance was the flower that seemed to be in bloom around his head. The old man slowly and carefully walked towards a lawn chair in front of his house, never once taking his eyes off the Straw Hats. his piercing gaze fixed on them with intensity the likes of which they had never seen. The intensity vanished instantly however when he reached his chair, as he then ignored the pirates as he took out his paper and casually began to read. "Hey old man, are you making light of us? We've got cannons over here you know, and we ain't afraid to use 'em." Sanji growled loudly at the strange old man. When Sanji spoke, the old man instantly turned his gaze back on them, the intensity of his stare returning wholeheartedly. He spoke after a moment, a dark and threatening voice, "Do that, someone is going to die." The Straw Hats believed this to be a threat and so readied themselves for a fight, everyone's hands inching towards their weapons. "Oh yeah, and who's that going to be?" scoffed Sanji. "Me of course." The old man's words set off Sanji, who made to jump over the side of the ship to attack him. Usopp and Yozuku immediately grabbed hold of Sanji and tackled him to the ground, where they restrained him, and despite being pinned to the deck of the ship, Sanji still struggled impotently. "Bastards messing with me," Sanji screamed from his position on the deck. "Hey old timer, who are you anyway?" Zoro asked. Once again the old man stared at the Straw Hat pirates with incredible intensity and without so much as blinking, once more setting the Straw Hats on edge. "Were you brought up or dragged up as a child? Don't you know it's rude to ask someone their name without giving yours first?" Suitably chastised, Zoro suddenly became embarrassed at having forgotten his manners. "Ah yeah, my name's Z. My name's Crocus and I'm the lighthouse keeper for the lighthouse at the entrance to the Grand Line. I'm 71 years old and I'm a Gemini." It was Zoro's turn to become enraged at the old man's words, and just like Sanji previously, he made to attack the old man. With Usopp and Yozuku still pinning Sanji to the deck of the ship, it fell to Jin and Johnny to stop Zoro in his tracks. Just like with Sanji, Zoro was pinned to the deck with Jin pinning his back and shoulders and Johnny sitting on his legs while he tried in vain to throw them off. "Any chance you can tell us where we are?" Luffy asked after fighting off a slight smirk at Zoro and Sanji's unfortunate positions. "I would have thought that was obvious. You were swallowed, weren't you?" At his question the Straw Hats all nodded mutely. "Then you should have worked out that you're in a whale's stomach," the old man said, scoffing. "And since when does a whale's stomach have a sky painted on it?" Alvida asked as she pointed to artificial sky. "I get bored," Crocus said simply with a shrug. Nami and Alvida both peered over the side of the Mary to see that the water they were floating on was green. "We need to leave now," Alvida said urgently, and the worry in her voice caused every head on the Mary to snap towards her. "That's not water we're floating on. We're inside a whale's stomach, it's got to be stomach acid." A thought suddenly occurred to Nami. If the old weirdo got himself in here and has gone to the effort of painting the inside of the whale's stomach, then he must have given himself a way out. "Hey Crocus, is there a way out of here?" Nami said as she voiced her line of thought. "Two, but I highly doubt you want to take one of them," Crocus said with a smirk before jerking a two. "Other exit is back over there." "So wait. You actually live in here?" said Usopp, his brow furrowed in confusion. "What are you, some kinda weirdo whale hermit?" Usopp's question once more caused Crocus to stare with such intensity it was as if he was peering into the soul. Only this time his gaze was fixed on Usopp and Usopp alone. Would you stop that?" Try as he might, Usopp was unable to stop the tiny tremor in his voice. Kids today just don't appreciate a running gag. The entire cavern-like stomach suddenly shook violently, causing the Mary to lurch dangerously. The Straw Hats fought to maintain their balance on the rocking ship while looking about the stomach to find the cause of the shaking. "Damn it, ease it again," and without another word Crocus jumped off his small island and into the stomach acid swimming beneath the surface. "Old fool's gone mental," Nami shouted as she held onto the guardrail of the Mary for dear life, as the stomach was still quaking, causing the Mary to continue to lurch over the turbulent waves of stomach acid. "We should leave. Like right now," Usopp shouted to Luffy. "What's the point? It's not like leaving is gonna do us any good." At the looks of disbelief on the faces of his crew, Luffy explained his conclusion. "We're inside a whale, that's underwater, so if we leave, we'll still be underwater," finished Nami, looking horror-struck at the Catch-22 situation they were now. They can't leave without dying, and if they stay in the stomach too long they're going to die. "Well, what are we going to do, big bro Luffy?" Yozuku asked, panicked, as he was attempting to rip his hair out from his spot atop Sanji. Luffy looked thoughtful for a moment before he sighed. "Not much we can do, till the old guy comes back. He's bound to have a way to make the whale resurface." A few faces nodded at his words, believing his plan to be their best chance of survival. After what seemed like an eternity but in reality couldn't have been longer than 10 minutes give or take, a door opened above them, startling several of the Straw Hats, causing them to draw their weapons. Looking up at what had caused the sudden disturbance, they saw two people. One was a fairly short teen with her blue hair tied back in a high ponytail, wearing incredulously short shorts, a black and white striped top that looked almost hypnotic, and a green fur-trimmed coat. Her companion was a weedy-looking teen wearing a green suit that made him look a little bit like a leprechaun, and a crown. Before anyone could take any action, Crocus pulled himself out of the stomach acid and back onto his little island. As he was shaking himself dry of the stomach acid that still clung to him, he noticed the Straw Hats were all looking at something above them. Turning his gaze upwards, he saw the intruders. "You two again? I've already told you. So long as I'm here, you won't lay a finger on Laboon." Crocus' declaration only seemed to humor the intruders, however, as the blue-haired teen let out a villainous laugh. "You're not getting in our way again, old man. We've been ordered to bring this whale home with us, and that's exactly what we're gonna do." Both intruders then whipped out, from seemingly thin air, two large bazooka and fired at Crocus. Crocus froze slightly at their act, as thus far they had proven to be a nuisance. Nothing more, but now they were willing to kill. Crocus was saved from his impending doom by the quick actions of Usopp, who upon seeing the intruders open fire whipped out two of his pistols and fired a single shot from each, taking out the two small rockets. Immediately after Usopp fired, Luffy darted behind the two assailants as lightning before kicking them from the doorway as soon as he turned back. The two attackers flew from the force of Luffy's kick straight down onto the Mary. When two intruders looked up to see where they had landed, they saw the impassive faces of the Straw Hats as they loomed over the two figures sprawled out on the deck. Not wanting to give them a chance to try anything again, Nami had Jin tie up both intruders. Luffy appeared on the deck of the Mary in a bright flash and looked down at the two restrained teens. While the boy looked unimpressive, and that was being as kind as he could, the girl was undoubtedly beautiful, and so Luffy turned on the charm. My, it's not every day a goddess such as yourself falls onto my ship," Luffy said, smiling as he looked her up and down. The combination of Luffy's compliment, his smile, and the look he was giving her caused the blue-haired teen to blush fiercely. Her blush made Luffy pause at the contradiction. Her behavior so far means she wants to be seen as villain, but she's so naive and innocent that she can't be a villain. "Thanks for that. Those greedy shit stains have been trying to hunt Laboon for 2 years now." Luffy just waved off Crocus' thanks. "How about you get us out of here, old-timer?" "Follow me," he said simply, and when he sat back down in his lawn chair, he pulled a lever that none of the Straw Hats had noticed until that moment, which caused a section of the stomach wall behind him begin to open up like a pair of doors. He threw a rope that he tied at one to a palm tree on his island before tossing the other end to the Mary. "Tie that to your ship and I'll tow you out." With the doors now fully open, the small island began moving towards the exit, pulling the Mary as it did so. The crew of the Mary could only look at their surroundings in amazement. "What on earth is all this?" Alvida asked as she voiced the question that had been on everyone's mind. Crocus just chuckled slightly, looking around at his handiwork as he did so. Call it a doctor's playful mind. He turned back to look at the Straw Hats and saw only confusion. "How could I possibly treat Laboon from the outside? Answer is I can't. So if I can't treat him from the outside, then I have no choice but to do it from the inside." "Makes sense," Luffy said sagely, nodding as he did so. "Like hell it does," Nami retorted. Crocus towed the Mary all the way through the exit tunnel, bringing them out the side of Laboon. Luffy had everyone sail the Mary to the lighthouse so they could inspect the ship for any damage. They had been in that stomach acid for quite some time, and the ship was only made of wood. Fortune seemed to be smiling on the Straw Hats, however, as the ship was undamaged from their sojourn into a whale's stomach. All throughout their inspection, though, the Straw Hats were treated to the mournful cries of Laboon as it stared at Reverse Mountain, tears clearly visible in its eyes. Wanting answers, the Straw Hats made their way to the lighthouse, where Crocus was sat at a patio table outside reading his newspaper. "Hey Crocus, so what's up with Laboon? You never said," Luffy questioned, dropping into a seat next to Crocus. Crocus let out a deep sigh. "You see those scars on Laboon's head?" Everyone looked over to Laboon, who had the top part of his head poking out of the water, and they saw the massive scars on its head that ran incredibly deep. "They're from him bashing his head against Reverse Mountain." "Why on earth would he do that?" Usopp asked incredulously. Because he thinks the mountain is all that keeping him from seeing his friends once more. The Straw Hats all shared a look of confusion at that but refrained from saying anything, instead opting to let Crocus speak. You see, when Laboon is an island whale from the West Blue, and when he was just a baby he was separated from his herd. However, he was saved by the Rumbar pirates, and when they left the West Blue for the Grand Line, Laboon followed them without them knowing. When they made it over Reverse Mountain they realized that Laboon had followed them, but it was too late to take him back. Their ship was also badly damaged and they had to spend a few months repairing their ship, and in that time they played with Laboon, sang with him and treated him as part of the crew. Part of their family. A few of the Straw Hats had a small smile on their face at what they were hearing. When they couldn't take Laboon with them, the Grand Line was just too dangerous, so they left him here with me. Left him behind with a promise that when they had sailed the Grand Line they'd return for him. That was 50 years ago now. They've left him alone by himself for 50 years. Usopp demanded to know with righteous anger coloring his words. Don't be stupid, Nami said as she rolled her eyes. This was 50 years ago. The Grand Line was still completely uncharted back then, so it was 100 times more dangerous than it is now. Those pirates probably died a long time ago, she finished sadly, her thoughts occupied by the emotional agony Laboon must have to go through every day. If only it were that simple. Those pirates didn't die on the Grand Line, they fled, with their tails between their legs. Disgust was clear in Crocus' voice as he spoke about the fate of the Rumbar pirates. Then why haven't you told Laboon? Why are you letting him think that they're coming back for him? Usopp demanded as he jumped to his feet, his previous only having grown. I did. Crocus slammed his hand down on the patio table in front of them in anger, which caused Usopp to shrink back slightly in fear. I've told him dozens of times but he won't listen. Laboon thinks his friends are just on the other side of the mountain and they can't get to him. That's why he constantly rams his head against the mountain. He's been trying for nearly 50 years to knock the mountain down so they can be reunited. Crocus finished sadly. The Straw Hats minus their captain all looked a little sad at Laboon's tale, his mournful cries once more resounding through the air. While his crew looked sad, Luffy looked both thoughtful and determined. With his mind made up and being reasonably sure that his plan was a good idea, he turned himself into lightning and teleported in front of Laboon, lashing out with a haymaker to his scarred head and knocking Laboon back slightly. So as not to fall into the water, he then teleported back onto land a short distance away from the lighthouse. Laboon, after being attacked, fixed his eyes on Luffy, and seeing his attacker on land he launched himself at Luffy, aiming to squash Luffy between his head and Reverse Mountain. Luffy jumped aside so as to avoid Laboon's lunge, and when Laboon lunged a second time Luffy caught Laboon's head in his hands, stopping the whale in its tracks as well as himself skidding backwards slightly. Pouring every last drop of strength he had into his arms, Luffy was able to push Laboon's head to one side, the whole move reminiscent of a swordsman parrying a blade. It's a draw, Luffy's announcement causing Laboon to freeze in his tracks. I'm stronger than I look, aren't I? But you already knew that, didn't you? Laboon answered Luffy's question with a high-pitched groan. You know, I can always tell when someone's spoiling for a fight. Your friends, they used to fight with you, didn't they? Laboon let out a long mournful moan that spoke volumes. I thought so. Here, wait there, I've got an idea. And with that Luffy flashed back to the Mary, emerging ashore while later holding several cans of paint. Despite Laboon's confusion at what Luffy was doing, he held perfectly still just as Luffy had asked. Once Luffy was done, he stood back on the rocky ledge to admire his artwork. The rest of the crew came to stand beside to see what he was looking so proud at, only to come face to face with a horrendous facsimile of their Jolly Roger. There you go, all done. Luffy announced proudly with his hands on his hips. That's my pirate mark, and from today it's also a symbol of my promise to you. I promise that we're gonna sail the entire Grand Line, then come back to see you. Now don't go bashing your head, otherwise the mark will come off. You hear me? The longer Luffy talked, the more and more excited Laboon became, until he was almost jumping out of the water in joy as tears of happiness gathered in his eyes. Returning to Crocus, Luffy flashed him a typical Luffy grin, displaying every single one of his teeth as he did so. This caused Crocus to smile slightly as he saw a ghost of the past, as his former captain Gold D. Roger had the exact same grin. There you go, old timer, Laboon won't be hurting himself from now on. He then turned to the rest of his crew. We should probably get going, we've only got another hour or two of daylight. Hold your horses, brat, You got a log pose? Luffy turned to Nami. Nami, did you pick up a log pose back on Logatown when you got all your charting supplies? Yeah, I did. The shop assistant was insistent on it. Not sure exactly how it works though. Crocus then explained to Nami and Luffy exactly how a log pose worked as well as some of the pitfalls that pirates usually fell into when first navigating the Grand Line. Jin, who had been nearby, was disappointed that such a simple piece of equipment was the reason that he and Don Krieg had wandered the Grand Line aimlessly for nearly 2 weeks before they were forced to flee. For what you've done for Laboon, I want you to have this, said Crocus as he emerged once more from his lighthouse. It's an eternal pose. Unlike the log pose that resets at every island, the eternal pose will only ever point to one location. Well, where does this point? Nami questioned as she looked curiously at the eternal pose, which looked very similar to a snow globe. A place called Drum Kingdom. I noticed you ain't got a ship's doctor, and Drum Kingdom is world renowned for their doctors. If you want a doctor, then you want one from there. Nodding his thanks and shaking Crocus' hand, Luffy motioned for everyone to board their ship. Weigh anchor. Jin unfurled the sails. Nami, you've got the log pose, I want you to man the helm. The crew scurried about completing the tasks or helping their fellow crew member to do so as Luffy looked on from his spot on the top deck in front of the helm. However, as Luffy looked over his crew, his gaze fell upon the 2 tied-up figures in the middle of the deck. Oh yeah. I forgot about you too. So what am I gonna do with you? We're from the nearby island of Whiskey Peak. If you were to return us, I'm sure the mayor would be more than happy to pay a reward. Despite the fact that she was tied up and surrounded by pirates, the blue-haired girl still managed to maintain a haughty and condescending demeanor. Luffy saw this as a chance to tease the girl and knock her off her high horse a little bit, so slowly and deliberately Luffy walked down the steps to the main deck and stepped in front of her. Placing one finger under her chin so she was forced to look him straight in the eye, he spoke. And just how do you know the price I ask for will be paid? Luffy's tone was light and carefree, but neither of the 2 captives were fooled by it. I know they will. I'm sure they'll pay whatever you want, she said quickly, and in Luffy's mind she sounded a bit desperate, which told him that despite what she wanted people to believe, she wasn't used to this kind of lifestyle. And just what happens if the price I ask is for you to spend a night and a day in my bed? Luffy asked with a smirk which turned into a grin as he watched her face turn bright red. Luffy genuinely believed that he could feel the heat of her blush on his face from his distance of over a foot away. Laughing slightly, he just gave her a wink which only served to fuel her blush, before he turned to Nami and saw that she was grinding her teeth and steam was practically coming from her ears. Mentally shrugging, believing that one of the crew must have upset her or something, he asked where they were heading. When Nami pointedly ignored him, he tried again. Oi Nami, which island are we heading to? This time, instead of simply asking, he yelled the question at the top of his voice. Whiskey Peak. Nami yelled back just as loud. Luffy turned to the blue-haired girl once more, where he smiled and winked. Looks like we're both in luck, sweet cheeks. Near Reverse Mountain, Grand Line. Since his captain had decided that they were providing an escort service to their 2 captives, Zoro decided that it was about time they at least something about them. So who are you 2 anyways? Zoro demanded, fixing them both with his usual menacing scowl as he squatted down in front of them where they were still tied up in the middle of the deck. Despite the fact that Zoro's scowl was indeed effective, the 2 captives did their best not to let it show. Instead, they kept their haughty attitude, as if they were attempting to look down their noses at the Straw Hats. You may call me Mr. 9, the weedy teen proclaimed proudly, and if he had not been tied to the mast of the ship, he would undoubtedly have been puffing out his chest. And you may call me Miss Wednesday, interjected the blue-haired girl, punctuating the end of her statement with her trademark villainous laugh. Those 2 names set off alarm bells in Zoro's mind, but for the life of him he was unable to work out why. Sadly for the 2 people he was interrogating, his confusion manifested in the form of a murderous glare leveled in their direction. You know, Zoro began slowly looking between the tied-up teens, I'm pretty sure I've heard names like that before. Zoro's words immediately set the 2 on edge as they began to sweat nervously. Captain may have decided to take you home, but that still leaves the question about what to do with you, till we get there. Zoro's face was only inches away from them by the time he finished speaking. Zoro, get Usopp and Johnny to empty the storage room and throw the weirdo in there. Luffy announced from the top deck, which had the effect of making Mr. Nine's head sag in defeat. What about the girl? Zoro asked despite having a pretty good idea what his captain was going to say. She can stay in my cabin. Unless she wants to join him, Luffy said with a smirk directed at Miss Wednesday. And just where are you gonna sleep? Nami screeched behind him from her place at the helm. Looking over his shoulder, Luffy said to her in a tone that conveyed just how ridiculous he found her question. In my cabin, duh. Nami let out a half growl and half screech as she grit her teeth and clenched her fists tightly before stomping away to the very stern of the ship as far away from Luffy as she could get while still managing their course. Luffy was just perplexed at Nami's reaction, so inwardly shrugging he turned back to smirk at Miss Wednesday. Miss Wednesday, upon seeing him looking back, ducked her head with her gaze locked on the deck of the ship, unable to meet his eyes. No, it's fine, I'll stay with Mr. 9, Miss Wednesday said in a quiet and barely audible voice that only served to fuel the smirk on Luffy's face that was slowly morphing into a full-blown grin. Despite still looking at the deck of the ship, Miss Wednesday could almost feel the grin aimed her, which caused her blush to deepen to epic proportions. In fact, Luffy was actually surprised she had any blood in the rest of her body, as it all seemed to be in her face and fueling her blush. As soon as Luffy's grin stretched across his entire face, he spoke one final time. Oh well, your loss. You got no idea what you're missing out on. And with those words he descended to the main deck and entered his cabin. Zoro couldn't help but shake his head slightly and roll his eyes at his captain's behavior. He may not know exactly what was going on with his captain and the sea witch, but one thing he did know was the captain had just dug himself a shallow grave. Giving the orders to Johnny and Usopp to prepare the storage room and turn into an impromptu ship's brig, Zoro untied their guests and escorted them to their new accommodations. Returning to the deck of the ship, none of the crew were anywhere to be found. As Zoro was wondering where they were, his stomach gave a loud growl, which was when he realized that everyone had missed dinner and they were most likely in the kitchen. Zoro made his way into the kitchen, and the first thing he noticed was the murderous intent radiating from Nami, which caused him to shiver slightly as he took the only available seat, which happened to be next to Luffy. It seemed to Zoro that he was not the only one that could see the killing intent being directed at Luffy, and the rest of the crew had sought to put as much distance between them and Luffy as possible while still being in the same room. Here's yours, shitty moss head, Sanji said as he set a plate of food down in front of Zoro. Luffy, either not noticing the glare being directed at him or simply not caring, sat in his seat eating happily. Hey Sanji, this is great. Thanks, Captain, Sanji said with a proud grin at the compliment to his food. After all, he put his entire heart and soul into his food, no matter how seemingly insignificant the meal seemed. How long till we reach Sake's summit? Luffy asked the entire group. Silence was his only answer, and looking up from his plate he noticed a few people shrugging. Still wanting an answer to his question, he turned his gaze to Nami, raising a single eyebrow in question. Don't know, was all Nami grumbled out from between clenched teeth. However, seeing that Luffy was still staring at her, she continued, maybe a week. Having the answer he sought, he gave Nami a wide smile that quickly fell when he noticed her glare had only intensified. Finally picking up on the tension in the room, Luffy quickly changed the subject. Might want to eat up, guys, you're gonna need your strength tomorrow. Oh yeah, why's that, Captain? Jin asked immediately, desperately hoping that a change in subject would ease the tension. Now that we're on the Grand Line, me and Zoro are gonna be stepping up your training. So far we've taught you some of the hockey training exercises, but now we're gonna intensify them. Various groans could be heard around the table at that proclamation, as for many of the Straw Hats the training had been hell. Only Sanji, Zoro and Jin grinned in anticipation, and in the case of Zoro the grin could be considered demonic. Right, might as well get some rest, it's gonna be a long day tomorrow after all. Luffy then finished the last few scraps of food and left to return to his cabin. Captain has a point, you all might want to get to bed or you won't be able to enjoy the fun as much tomorrow, Zoro said before he mimicked Luffy's actions, and he too went to bed. The next day, Mr. 9 and Miss Wednesday were sat on the railing of the Mary as they watched the captain and his first mate put the crew through their paces in what was in their opinion a ridiculous training regiment, and wincing slightly every time a wooden practice sword made contact with flesh. You guys can't just dodge aimlessly, you need to stretch out with your senses and anticipate where the attack is coming from before you dodge, Luffy called out over the sound of thumping flesh as he looked over the exercise he had his crew doing. The entire crew were divided into pairs, with one sat on the floor wearing a blindfold and the other repeatedly striking their partner over the head with a wooden sword as they attempted to dodge. It wasn't an easy skill to awaken, and Luffy wasn't disappointed that they hadn't made much progress, as they had only been learning for not even 2 full months yet. It was just as Luffy was thinking about the lack of progress they had been making that he watched as Sanji swung his wooden sword with all his might, only to hit nothing but thin air as Zoro leaned forwards in a perfectly timed dodge. Luffy stared at Zoro with rapt intensity and watched as Zoro managed to repeat his previous success another 2 times before his streak came to end as Sanji's strike connected with his temple. Luffy decided that this was enough hockey training for the day and gave the order to stop. "Good work, guys," Luffy proclaimed with a grin as he stood in front of the crew with his hands on his hips. A few crew members perked up at his words while the majority groaned in pain as they still felt the agony of the training. "I mean it." Sincerity was clear in Luffy's voice. Zoro even managed to awaken his haki when he dodged a few of Sanji's strikes. "We just need to make it more consistent," he said, directing the last part to Zoro, who gave him a nod to show that he agreed with his words. "And let's face it, Zoro's not exactly got that much of a head start on this, so you guys can easily catch up to him." "What's next, Captain?" Zoro asked, wincing in pain as he did so. Sanji's last strike had truly knocked him for 6. "We get some food, then get some strength and speed training done." Why are you doing this to us, Captain?" Usopp cried, and when Luffy looked at him he saw that Johnny, Yozuku, Nami and Alvida all seemed to agree with his words. "I've told you the Grand Line's a dangerous place, and as captain it's my job to protect you all. But I can't be everywhere at once, so you all need to be stronger." Luffy looked over to the 2 bystanders who had been silently watching the whole training so far. "Hey, do you 2 want to get in on this?" This panicked the 2 guests aboard the Mary, and they began to frantically wave their hands in front of them and shake their heads violently as they stammered out numerous excuses that made no sense whatsoever. Luffy just grinned at them, having already known what their response was going to be. "Well, we're gonna be sailing together for another week at least, so if you change your mind feel free to join in." After the first night on the Grand Line, Nami decided that they would need to drop anchor at night rather than risk sailing at night because the sea's currents and weather patterns were far too unpredictable. This slowed down their voyage to the next island, but the entire crew agreed it was better to get to their destination slower than get lost and not get there at all. The next week passed by in a blur for the Straw Hats as they trained daily. Unfortunately, Zoro still remained the only one to have awakened the power of observation, and even then it was still inconsistent. Despite the fact that the others had yet to awaken their power of observation, that was not to say they hadn't begun to reap the benefits of their training. So far, Usopp, Johnny and Yozuku had added some muscle mass and toned up from their strength training, which meant that the trio had gone from a string bean build to having an athletic frame. It was during training that Nami attempted to get her own back on Luffy for his insensitivity. She took part in the various exercises one day wearing her brand new exercise clothes that were too tight in all the right places. This was done in order to catch Luffy's eye and get his blood boiling, only to leave stew in his frustration. She was pleased that she did manage to catch him eyeing her several times, but was frustrated herself when Luffy was seemingly unaffected. Sanji was more affected by Nami's actions than Luffy, and the more hot and bothered he became, the worse his flirting became. Sanji's incessant flirting wasn't only limited to Nami though, as both Alvida and Miss Wednesday were assaulted by Sanji's attempt at romance. No matter how embarrassed Miss Wednesday became or how hard Alvida bashed Sanji over the head with her iron mace, he still returned for more, something that Luffy admitted to himself took serious dedication. The crew had been sailing for 12 days when Zoro, tired of only crossing blades with Johnny and Yozuku, asked to spar with Luffy. Seeing no reason to disagree, Luffy joined Zoro in the middle of the deck and drew his sword. "Why are you still using that piece of junk, Captain?" Zoro asked, confused. "Well, it's not like I've got another one laying about, is it?" Luffy said slowly and privately, wondering if he was missing something. "What you on about? I got you a new sword back in Logatown, a pretty damn good one too." Zoro looked at Luffy, who had just raised a single eyebrow. "I did give it to you, didn't I?" Luffy gave Zoro a small shake of his head. "Ah well, just wait here." Zoro went to his cabin to retrieve the sword he had bought for Luffy, finding it under his bed after rooting around for a while. Handing the sword to Luffy, he watched as his captain was rendered speechless by the beauty of the sword, and pulling it from its scabbard he marveled at the obsidian blade. "She got a name?" Luffy asked, not taking his eyes off his new sword as he took in every aspect of its beauty, from the sapphires in the hilt to the intricate design on the scabbard. "It's called Gambit." Luffy's eyes took on a gleam as he fell in love with his new saber, but also began thinking how much cooler his sword looked to Shanks. Snapping out of his reverie, he held up his new saber ready to cross blades with Zoro. "So we doing this or what?" Zoro also readied his blades after tying his bandana around his head. The rest of the crew suddenly stopped whatever exercises they were still doing when they noticed Luffy and Zoro squaring off against one another. It was Zoro that made the first move as he jumped at Luffy, swiping at him with the blades held in his hands. Luffy ducked under one strike and parried the second before he brought his sword up in a slash aimed at Zoro's chest, which was avoided as Zoro hastily jumped backwards. Not wanting to lose the opportunity, Luffy pressed the advantage as he leapt at Zoro as he brought his sword down in an arc in an attack that would have bisected Zoro if it had connected. However, it was Zoro's turn to counter as he deflected Luffy's strike with a single blade, then launched a devastating flurry of strikes with all three of his blades. Luffy was hard-pressed to defend himself from the onslaught as he danced around several strikes and blocking many more. Needing to put a bit of distance between himself and Zoro, he jumped backwards, landing over a dozen feet away, and just as his feet touched the deck of the ship he swung his sword straight upwards with all his might. This caused a blade of pressurized air to be launched at Zoro, who in turn brought both of his swords down in a downwards arc and cut the air blades. The two combatants continued to spar for some time, the tide of their fight maintaining its back and forth tempo. Eventually Luffy held a hand up, gave the signal to stop. "You know you're pretty handy with that sword, Captain," Zoro complimented as he regained his breath. "Yeah, but I'm at my limit as a swordsman," Luffy breathed out between ragged breaths. "You on the other hand, the sky's the limit." Straightening up after regaining his breath, he added, "We should get you working on creating air blades as well." At this, Zoro perked up as it was a skill that Mihawk had displayed back at the Baroque. "It's hard to do, but it's not difficult to understand. Basically you've just gotta swing your sword as hard and as fast as you can. This'll create a blade of air that moves in the direction of your swing." Zoro nodded to show his understanding of what was required to perform this technique. "You wanna go again, Captain? Can't get better unless I fight someone worthy now, can I?" "Maybe later, right now I'm hungry." Luffy's gaze then sought out Sanji. "Oi Sanji, I'm hungry. Any chance you can cook me up some meat?" Sanji pulled a fresh cigarette from his pack before nodding as he lit his cigarette and heading back to his kitchen to satiate his captain's often insatiable appetite. "How long till we get to Sake Summit anyways?" Luffy asked the group, expecting someone to know the answer. Mr. Nine whispered conspiratorially to his companion, "How many times do we have to tell him that it's called Whiskey Peak?" Without taking her eyes off Luffy, just in case he was listening in to what they were saying to one another, she whispered back to him, "Sometimes I think he's nothing more than an idiot, but the rest of the time it's like that's all just an act." Mr. Nine, at hearing his partner's words, looked intently at Luffy and thought back on all their previous encounters before coming to his own conclusion. "Nah, I'm pretty sure he's just an idiot." Neither one of them spoke any more about Luffy as they saw him making his way to war. He had overheard them. They suddenly clammed up. "Nami's just told me we should be at Sake Summit by this afternoon." "It's Whiskey Peak, you moron," Mr. Nine yelled at Luffy, his anger at the name of his home being mangled in such a way overriding his self-preservation instincts. Miss Wednesday, however, was more interested in Luffy's small smirk that vanished as quickly as it came, which told her that Luffy knew exactly what the island was called and was only calling it Sake Summit to garner a reaction from them. This worried her somewhat because that proved that this pirate captain was actively trying to make him seem like an idiot, most likely to seem as small of a threat as possible. "Oh, that's good news," Miss Wednesday said lamely as she was still slightly uncomfortable in Luffy's presence because of the heavy flirting he was prone to. Luffy just nodded with a smirk on his face, with his gaze inciting a blush on Miss Wednesday's face. With the two guests being informed that they were nearly home, he turned and headed to the kitchen to savor more of Sanji's delicious food. It was later that afternoon, just as the sun was beginning to set, that Zoro, whose turn it was to man the crow's nest, spotted an island in the distance. Taking out the spyglass he'd borrowed from his captain, and mentally added buying his own to his to-do list. Zoro observed the landmass in the distance. "Land dead ahead, Captain." Zoro called down to the rest of the crew, alerting them to the fact they had reached their destination. The rest of the crew gathered at the bow of the ship so they could take in the sight of their first island of the Grand Line, where they were soon joined by Zoro. Their view, however, was obstructed as the Mary began to enter a thick fog. In fact, the fog was so thick that the Straw Hats were unable to see more than a few feet in front of the ship. Worried that they may crash into the island, the crew set about reading in the sails to reduce their speed. Just as they done that, the fog began to clear little by little. As the fog was clearing, the Straw Hats could make out more and more of the island. This also meant that the inhabitants of the island could see them, which was made obvious by the noise they were making. What was surprising to the Straw Hats, though, was that the noise was cheering in celebration. And with the fog now almost entirely cleared, the Straw Hats could see what seemed to be every inhabitant of the island lined up on the shore, cheering and waving at them. "Now I've seen everything, an island that actually welcomes pirates," Jin said in disbelief. "The Grand Line sure is a weird place." Luffy replied in a tone that suggested that his response explained everything. Luffy looked at the rest of his crew and was amused to see Usopp flexing his newly acquired muscles at the girls of the island while Sanji blew kisses at them. Jin simply grinned happily at the reception he was getting as he waved back at the civilians, while Johnny and Yozuku, ever the simpletons, stood proudly side by side on the guardrail of the Mary as they did all of what their fellow crewmates were doing. As for Alvida, she simply looked bored at it all as she rolled her eyes as the men in the crowd declared their love for her. The most interesting reactions, though, were Zoro and Nami, as both of them looked at the gathered crowd with suspicion. Luffy too shared their suspicions, as no matter how friendly an island was, nobody welcomed pirates with open arms like these people. This told Luffy that this was an attempt to lull unsuspecting pirates into a false sense of security. After all, what better way to do that than by being non-threatening and playing on the pirates' vanity? Sharing a look with Nami and Zoro, who had caught one another's eye, he gave them a slight nod, and as they disembarked the Mary he whispered to them to not only keep their guard up but to also go with flow and not let on their suspicious. A tall man with freakishly curly hair met them at the docks and greeted them cheerfully. "Welcome, pirates. My name's Igarapoy and I'm the mayor of Whiskey Peak, the Grand Line's friendliest and most welcoming rest stop. Here you will be invited to drink and feast and rest your weary selves. All we ask is that you share all your courageous tales of your bravery." This was evidently the right thing to say, as half the crew once more started blowing kisses and flexing their muscles at the crowd. "Well, he certainly knows how to manipulate a weak-willed idiot," Nami thought to herself. Obeying her captain's orders, Nami plastered a convincing fake smile on her face as she smiled at the crowd. "Oh yeah, we picked up 2 people that said they were from this island," and Luffy, seeing that he had the mayor's attention, continued while idly scratching his face. "One's a weirdo that wears a plastic crown, the other's a blue-haired hottie." As Luffy was talking, he carefully watched the mayor's reactions as he went from being happy that Mr. Nine and Miss Wednesday had been rescued to furious at how Luffy spoke about Miss Wednesday. This told Luffy that the mayor was incredibly close with the girl, with how worked up he got over Luffy talking about her like he did. The Straw Hats were led into one of the nearby building that turned out to be a large tavern, and true to the mayor's word, the crew were fed and allowed to drink to their heart's content. Sadly for the mayor of Whiskey Peak, he had severely underestimated the appetite of the Straw Hats as well as the amount of alcohol they could drink. Plate after plate of food was consumed by the small crew of pirates until they had almost eaten the island out of house and home. Wanting to try and knock the pirates out, a drinking competition was established with a prize of 100,000 belly, and the ever-greedy navigator of the Straw Hats press ganged Zoro and Luffy into drinking with her. The townspeople that the trio had been drinking against began to fall one by one, and as they did, Luffy and Zoro kept an eye on the rest of the crew, and they watched as Sanji and Usopp passed out surrounded by women with lipstick marks all over their faces. Johnny and Yozuku fell not long after them, however, with that duo Luffy believed it to be due to the excitement of the day more than anything else. Jin and Alvida were the last of the crew to fall asleep as they held bottles of rum in their hands. This set alarm bells in Luffy's head, as he knew both Jin and Alvida could handle their booze even better than he could, which could only mean the alcohol was being tampered with. When the last of their drinking opponents finished puking their guts out and passed out, Luffy nudged Zoro under the table, giving him a subtle signal to pretend to fall asleep. Then turning his head to Nami, who was seated directly next to him, he buried his face in the crook of her neck so nobody watching could see him, whisper to her, "We both need to pretend to fall asleep, and then when we're alone I want you to do what you do best." Nami, who had closed her eyes and brought one hand up to the back of Luffy's head and grasped his hair tightly. To the other patrons of the tavern it seemed that Luffy and Nami were simply two lovers that were getting friendly with each other, so they paid them little mind. "Oh yes," Nami murmured in pleasure, her tone concealing that the two were planning anything. With their plan concocted, Luffy let his head fall and hit the table as he feigned sleep, with Nami following suit a moment later, and with that the patrons of the tavern relaxed and let out a sigh of relief as they slipped out of the tavern to begin setting the rest of their plan in place and to stand guard from outside. The tall nun that had been serving the group drinks all night approached Garp at the docks, pulling off her habit as she did so. "I don't see why we had to go through that entire ridiculous charade when we could have just ambushed those fools at the docks. Thanks to those pirates the entire island's nearly out of food and they've drunk us dry." Garp, who was stood with Miss Wednesday and Mr. Nine, shook his head. "ATSS Monday, you should know better than anyone that appearances can be deceiving." From within Garp's long coat he pulled out a stack of wanted posters that Miss Monday snatched and quickly examined. "What?" Miss Monday screeched in disbelief as she repeatedly flicked through each and every one of the wanted posters. "You mean to tell me that that pipsqueak in the straw hat is worth 65 million and him and his crew is worth nearly 150 million? Garp only nodded his head sagely. "Then what are we doing out here? We need to get in there and cut their throats while we still can." "Miss Monday, you must calm yourself. We have them incapacitated and at our mercy. Besides, the bounty drops 30% if they're handed over dead. After all, the world government likes to stage public executions," Garp said calmly. His calm, however, was soon shattered when he heard a voice from the nearby tavern rooftop. "I'd appreciate it if you could leave my friends to sleep for a while. We've had a long journey to get here after all," Zoro said with condescension dripping from his voice. Just as the assembled group at the docks looked up and saw Zoro stood on the roof of the tavern with one sword drawn and slung carelessly over his shoulder, one of the group's underlings ran up to them in a panic. "Mr. 8, sir. 3 of the pirates have vanished." Their gazes then snapped back to Zoro, who only smirked down at them. There's no way they could see through this charade, Garp thought angrily. More and more underlings made their way to the docks, having been alerted to a problem when they heard their comrades yelling. Zoro only looked around the ever-growing group impassively, not worried about their force in the slightest. "Let me guess, you out on a big show for naive pirates so you can drug them before robbing them blind, then selling them to the world government to get their bounty. Isn't that right, Baroque Works?" Zoro said, and shouting the name of their organization for all of them to hear. Zoro's knowledge of their organization sent a ripple of fear through the bounty hunters as they wondered what else the green-haired swordsman knew about their highly secretive group. How do you know about Baroque Works?" Garp demanded, his nervousness clear. Garp was nervous. He had clearly underestimated the Straw Hats, as not only had they seen through their act but had also deceived them and knew things that they couldn't possibly know. "I used to be in the same line of work as you and made a bit of a name for myself back in the East Blue. Eventually someone from Baroque Works tried recruiting me, but the whole thing seemed a bit shady to me. Never knowing who is in charge and all those cheesy code names." Zoro shook his head before he threw it back as he let out a full belly laugh that only served to unnerve the assembled bounty hunters. "That recruiter wouldn't take no for an answer though, so I had to kill him. Now there's 100 of you and only one of me, so this shouldn't take longer than an hour." Those words were the last things spoken before Zoro attacked. Ever since his spar with Luffy, Zoro had wanted to try out the move that Luffy had used against him, and this was the perfect opportunity to practice throwing some of those wind blades. So with 2 of his swords now in hand, he swung them down with all his might and sending 2 wind blades into the crowd of bounty hunters. While not quite as powerful as the one Luffy had produced earlier in their spar, each wind blade still cut through over a dozen bounty hunters each. Zoro's attack was the cue for the bounty hunters of Baroque Works to attack. As dozens of bounty hunters began making their way towards him, Zoro jumped from the rooftop he was on and retreated back further into the town so as to reduce the risk of a gunman getting a lucky shot in on him. As Zoro made his way deeper into the town, hopping from rooftop to rooftop, various bounty hunters began attacking from all directions. Zoro dodged and parried before he swiped at each of the bounty hunters, and with each swipe of his sword he felled another. Sometimes he merely incapacitated them, but more often than not the bounty hunter fell to ground dead. When Zoro had jumped onto the newest rooftop, he came face to face with both Mr. Nine and Miss Wednesday. Mr. Nine jumped at Zoro, wildly swing a baseball bat, and in response Zoro sidestepped the amateurish strike before he lifted his leg and stuck his foot straight into Mr. Nine's chest, which sent him flying over the side of the building and plummeting straight to the street below. While Zoro was distracted dealing with Mr. Nine, Miss Wednesday attacked with her weapon of choice, which happened to be two sharpened rings attached to her fingers by a wire. Zoro lazily dodged the attacks sent his way by Miss Wednesday, but when he caught a smell of her perfume his reaction slowed considerably until he became all but incapable of moving. "Ha ha ha, you've fallen into my trap. My perfume, it makes me irresistible, doesn't it?" Miss Wednesday said mockingly as she idly twirled her peacock slashers. As she got within range of attacking Zoro, she was shocked to her core when the swordsman, who should be incapable of moving, stepped behind her and lashed out with the scabbard of one of his swords, striking her in the back of the head, knocking her to the ground. She was saved from hitting the ground when she landed on her giant pet duck, which then carried her safety. While Zoro was rapidly thinning the numbers of Baroque Works agents, Luffy appeared behind Igarappoi, but instead of getting the agent's attention, Luffy decided to relieve himself off the side of the dock. The sound of pouring water alerted Igarappoi to something behind him, and he spun around only to see Luffy with his in his hand pissing over the side of the dock, which caused Igarappoi's jaw to fall. "These pirates think so little of us that he's comfortable pissing in front of me without any thought to defending himself. Will our humiliation never end?" Igarappoi thought to himself as he stared at Luffy. "I see Zoro's having fun," Luffy said over his shoulder and looking at Igarappoi. Igarappoi was about to respond when Karoo, Miss Wednesday's giant pet duck, came running to the docks carrying both Miss Wednesday and her partner. We just can't. They're too strong." Miss Wednesday immediately froze when she saw Luffy standing at the docks and began to sweat. Before anything more could be said, the sound of shrill laughter filled the air, and everyone at the docks spun around to see two newcomers. The female of the duo was carrying a parasol and was wearing a short yellow dress with a lemon pattern on it that stopped mid-thigh, whereas the man was a long brown overcoat with a purple scarf and tacky sunglasses. The sight of the two newcomers caused the remaining Baroque Works agents to pale considerably and take a step back. "Mr. 5, Miss Valentine. Thank the heavens you're here to help with these pirates," Igarappoi shouted nervously while praying that he was mistaken about their reason for coming to Whiskey Peak. His hope was soon dashed when Miss Valentine's shrill laughter sounded out once again. "You really think me and my partner came all the way to this shithole at the start of the Grand Line to bail you losers out? We were given an order by the boss. Apparently, someone knows his secret. Now I don't know what that secret is, and I don't want to know either, but our orders are to eliminate everyone that does," Mr. 5 declared, and his words sent terror through Miss Wednesday and Igarappoi. "Isn't that right, Princess Vivi Nefertiti of Alabasta? Haha, I knew you were only pretending to a bad guy and you were nice underneath everything," Luffy said, drawing everyone's attention to him. Luffy then stepped around Igarappoi and positioned himself between Vivi and the two Baroque Works agents. "Now why don't you two leave while you've still got the legs to carry you?" Mr. 5's response to Luffy's statement was to stick his finger up his nose and root around. He then WD flicked a bogey straight at Luffy, and as soon as it connected with him he was engulfed in an explosion. "Takes care of him," said Mr. 5 before looking straight at Vivi. Once more digging his finger in his nose, he readied another attack, only to be thrown off balance when the smoke from his last attack cleared. Did you just flick your nose pickings at me?" Luffy asked in a dangerous voice. Everyone turned to look at Luffy, who was completely unharmed with a pissed-off look on his face. Throwing his hand up into the air, lightning began to envelop his hand before it expanded past his hand, then morphed into the shape of a giant warhammer. Thunder God's lightning hammer. Luffy then swung his hand down at the two agents. Miss Valentine was able to avoid the attack by utilizing her own devil fruit powers and turning her body weight to a single kilogram, which caused her to fly up into the air. Mr. 5 on the other hand took the full brunt of the attack and fell to the ground, twitching and covered in severe burns. 10,000 kilogram press. Miss Valentine shouted from above Luffy, and with that she plummeted towards the ground at high speed. Luffy however made no effort to move and simply stood in place. Miss Valentine, believing that she was catching the pirate off guard, began to cackle madly. However, as she made contact with Luffy, she passed straight through him and the lightning that made up his body began coursing through her, the voltage overwhelming her and sending her flying away unconscious. You know, I've been inside plenty of girls, but that's probably the first time a girl's been inside of me," Luffy stated with humor evident in his voice. His comment also served to cause everyone else present to gape at him. "Now princess, you don't mind if me and my crew leave, do you?" Luffy asked rhetorically with a smirk. Wait, Igarappoi pleaded, getting Luffy's attention. "You're strong, the Mr. 5 pair were no pushovers and you took them out like they were nothing. You can protect the princess and get her back home to Alabasta. I know I've got no right to ask this of you, but please help." Luffy, who had begun to walk away, stopped mid-step. "What's in it for me? Actually, you know what, I'm sure we can work something out." And as he said that, he gave Vivi a smirk which made her stare at the ground intently. "You, curly hair, be a pal and wake my crew and tell them I want them back on the ship." Yes. Yes, of course," and with that Igarappoi went into the tavern to rouse Straw Hats. While Igarappoi was gone, Zoro and Nami, who was carrying a large bag of loot, returned and was filled in on everything by Luffy. The thought of possible reward money caused Nami's eyes to sparkle in anticipation, and she saddled up to Vivi and slung an arm over her shoulders. When the rest of the crew returned to the docks, they tried to talk Luffy into letting them stay at least another night. Luffy's response to their complaining was to gesture all around him, and it was then that the other Straw Hats noticed all the death and destruction around them. How they hadn't spotted it when they first came out of the tavern, Luffy would never know, but all that it told him was their observation hockey needed to be stepped up. Igarappoi also came out of the tavern, however when everyone saw what he was wearing they froze. Luffy even vomited in his mouth slightly. Igarappoi had changed his outfit, so he was now wearing something that looked similar to what Vivi was wearing, and judging by how small and tight it was fairly obvious that Igarappoi had simply pilfered it from her wardrobe. "Princess Vivi, give me the Alabasta eternal pose. I'll be a decoy and make my way there, taking a direct route while you can sneak around through the back." Reluctantly, Vivi handed over her eternal pose before suddenly throwing her arms around Igarappoi and hugging him for all she was worth. The Straw Hats gave them a moment to themselves as they began to board the Mary. After they waited patiently, Vivi finally boarded the ship and she watched as Igarappoi sailed away in a small sailboat. An explosion suddenly engulfed Igarappoi's sailboat, making Vivi scream in panic. The explosion also served to light a fire under the Straw Hats, and they rapidly got the Mary out to sea. As they were sailing away, Luffy felt an unknown presence behind them, and Luffy let out a sigh when he realized that he was the only person that had sensed that someone had snuck aboard the ship. "Make sure to watch out for the rocks," the voice said cheerfully from the very stern of the ship. "Don't worry, I will," Nami replied, not noticing the voice was one she had never heard before. "At least we're away from that dreadful island," the mystery voice once again piped up. "Yeah. Hang on, who the hell are you?" Nami said, finally looking around at the mystery voice. This had the knock-on effect of causing the other crew members to look at the mystery voice. "Miss All Sunday," Vivi shouted, providing a name to go along with the new face. This also told the Straw Hats that she was a member of Baroque Works. "You know, this really is a nice ship." "Yeah, I think so too," said Luffy with a smile and taking in the sight of Miss All Sunday. "Love the SXY cowgirl look you've got going on." "Luffy, you can't flirt with her, she's Mr. Zero's partner. She's the partner of Sir Crocodile." Vivi shouted, and everyone aboard the ship, including Miss All Sunday, to stop and stare at her stupidity in revealing such a thing. Vivi, however, continued without stopping to think about the bombshell she had just dropped. Everyone. She's the one I followed when I was gathering information on who is behind all my country's problems. Correction, I'm the one who allowed you to follow me." Miss All Sunday took a great deal of delight in seeing the dawning look of realization on the princess's face. After all, how could I not? It was all just so amusing. A princess that infiltrates a criminal organization to save her kingdom. It's almost storybook. That's all well and good, but what I want to know is just what exactly I can do for the lovely Miss All Sunday," Luffy said as he looked straight at Miss All Sunday. Miss All Sunday took out an eternal pose to Alabasta, just like the one Vivi had handed over to Igarappoi, and tossed it to Luffy, who caught it effortlessly. According to you log pose, your next destination is Little Garden, and if you go there you won't survive long enough to leave. I'm the captain and I decide where the ship goes. Luffy declared proudly and with a hint of anger, and he was about to crush the eternal pose in his hand when another voice stopped him. If he hadn't been so distracted by the SXY cowgirl, then the voice wouldn't have been able to sneak up on him. You know, if you don't want that, can I have it? Zoro, who was still feeling embarrassed that Miss All Sunday was able to sneak aboard the Mary, was now livid that a second intruder had got on the ship without him noticing. And just who the hell are you? Zoro demanded, a question that was not answered by the intruder but by his own captain. Ace! Luffy shouted excitedly, and the rest of the crew could only think, what the hell? Whiskey Peak, the Grand Line. Ace! Luffy screamed in excitedly. You know this guy, Captain? Zoro questioned as he eyed the newcomer. The second intruder was wearing black combat boots, plain black shorts and no top, with an orange cowboy hat that had 2 buttons on it that looked like grinning faces. Of course I do. That's my big brother Ace, Luffy announced as he finally took his eyes off Ace and looked at Zoro. At Luffy's explanation at who the intruder was, Zoro shrugged and fixed his gaze back onto the female intruder, who, now that Zoro looked closely, no longer looked as confident as she did previously. The recently identified Ace grinned broadly at Luffy before he allowed his eyes to roam over the others aboard the Going Merry, his eyes lingering on each person for just a few moments. Nice crew you've got yourself here, bro, Ace said while the grin never left his face. While Ace was getting acquainted with the crew of the Straw Hats, Miss All Sunday was frozen in fear, and a cold sweat slowly trickled down her brow and what felt like a ball of lead formed in her stomach. This was because despite the jovial atmosphere in front of her, she recognized the infamous Fire Fist Ace and was aware of his 550 million bounty. His relation to the Straw Hats was not something she foreseen, and she realized she needed to make a quick getaway. Insensibly enough, despite the intense fear she was feeling at that precise moment, Miss All Sunday didn't let an ounce of it show on her face as she maintained her stoic mask of indifference. Shifting her body language slightly to give off an impression of smug nonchalance, she stood up on the rail she had previously been perched upon. Well, this is where we must part ways. She then allowed a small smirk onto her face before continuing. I do hope you survive Little Garden. With her final parting shot uttered, she walked along the rail, her calm demeanor betraying none of her nervousness, before jumping onto the back of her ride, which happened to be a giant turtle. At the departure of Miss All Sunday, Ace looked at Luffy with a single eyebrow raised in silent question. Unable to actually answer the question Ace was silently asking, Luffy just gave a careless shrug and said, meh. Before he could get too bogged down with catching up with his brother and wanting to be shipped to be on its way to the next island, he turned to Nami, take the helm and keep our course steady. At her captain's instructions, Nami immediately took the helm and altered their course according to the log post. Luffy, seeing Nami doing as requested, turned back to Ace. So Ace, you never did say what you wanted this eternal pose for. As he said this, he grinned at his brother while spinning the eternal pose on his fingertip as if it was a basketball. However, the grimace that flashed across Ace's face at his statement confused him. I'm back in this part of the Grand Line hunting somebody, said a very grim-faced Ace. The crew of the Straw Hats could only look on in shock as somebody who up till this moment been every bit happy-go-lucky and carefree as their own captain turned deadly serious at the drop of a hat. "Ha! You turned to bounty hunting or summit, Ace?" Luffy asked with mirth evident in his voice. Ace shook his head slightly before he explained. I'm chasing a man called Teach. He was part of my division of the Whitebeard Pirates before he committed the greatest crime a pirate can commit. Ace leaned back against the guardrail of the Going Merry and folded his arms before taking a fortifying breath. He murdered the 4th Division commander and stole a devil fruit before jumping ship. Locking eyes with Luffy, he continued. I need that eternal pose to get to Alabasta before him. Luffy stared down Ace in silent contemplation, not about whether or not to give Ace the eternal pose, as he had already decided to give him it the moment Ace had asked for it, but about the burden of responsibility the Ace was feeling at the death of a crewmate. Nodding slightly, he gave his brother a wide grin. One condition though. Ace tilted his head slightly and had a small smile on his face hearing this, as he had a good idea what this one condition would be. You gotta stay here on my ship tonight. I can't be letting my big bro just disappear before we even have time to catch up. Hearing this, Ace let out a loud and almost bark-like laugh before quickly stepping forwards and grabbing Luffy in a headlock and giving him a noogie. The rest of the Straw Hats could only smile or laugh at the brotherly interaction. "So, you gonna introduce me to the rest of your crew, bro?" A moment after had Ace asked that question, Luffy stamped his foot onto Ace's twisted slightly before mule kicking him in a place that made every male member of the Straw Hats wince. This action forced Ace to not only release his hold on Luffy but also drop to the deck of the ship holding his family jewels. Luffy just took a moment to laugh at his brother's pain before offering him a hand and helping him to his feet. Slinging an arm over his brother's shoulder, he said about introductions between his brother and his crew, pointing at each member of the Straw Hats as he introduced them. "That there is Zoro, my first mate and future world's best swordman." Hearing this, Zoro gave Ace and Luffy a slight grin as well as an incline of his head. "This is Sanji, my chef, and I swear his food is the beat you'll ever taste." Just like Zoro, Sanji gave the two brothers a grin before lighting another cigarette. "A chain-smoking chef? Well damn, now I've seen just about everything," Ace chuckled lightly. "Moving on, this is Usopp, my ship's gunner and marksman, and I kid you not, he's the best shot this side of the Grand Line." At his captain's praise, Usopp puffed out his chest and stood in what he believed to be a heroic pose. Sadly, instead of looking heroic, he just looked ridiculous. "This is Jin, he's my bosun. Now this beauty is Alvida, my quartermaster." A word of warning, though she's just as deadly with her mace as she is beautiful. A look of shock briefly adorned Alvida's face at hearing Luffy proclaim her to be the ship's quartermaster, as he had yet to tell her of her role aboard the ship. "Up at the helm is my gorgeous navigator, and I promise you she's the only navigator you'll ever find that can plot a course through uncharted waters in the middle of a storm." Nami tried not to let Luffy's words of praise get to her, but she couldn't help the faint blush adorning her cheeks, a blush that Ace picked up on. "And last but not least, this is Johnny and Yosuke." Okay, but which one's which?" questioned Ace. Several seconds passed as Luffy attempted to remember which one was which before he responded, "This is Johnny and Yosuke." Realizing what Luffy was getting him and not asking again, "Okay, so what's their role aboard the ship?" At this question, Luffy looked over to Zoro, who simply gave a slight shrug of his shoulders. Not getting any help from his first mate, Luffy turned back to his brother. "Cabin boys," was his simple response. Upon hearing that they were the ship's cabin boys, both Johnny and Yosuke sunk to the deck of the ship on their knees in depression over being the lowest rung of the totem pole. Facing the rest of the crew, Luffy addressed them. "Everyone, this is my big brother Fire Fist Ace." Various greetings were called out by the crew of the Straw Hat Pirates while Ace simply waved at them all, at least for the few seconds it took for Luffy's introduction to sink in. When who Ace actually was did sink in, several of the Straw Hats nearly had a heart attack. After all, everyone has heat D of the infamous 2nd Division commander of the Whitebeard Pirates. Ace looked around at the Straw Hats, obviously amused at their reaction to who he is. "I want to thank you all for looking after my kid brother. I know he can be a pain and all," he finished with a grin. Luffy simply rolled his eyes at his brother's words before he turned to Sanji. "Yo Sanji, how about you show my brother how awesome your food is and whip us all up something to eat?" Sanji replied with a slight grin on his face before making his way over to the kitchen. "Nami, are we on course?" Luffy asked, and after an affirmative response from his navigator he continued, "Have we put enough distance between us and Sake Summit?" Unseen by Luffy, Nami gave a small eye roll before responding with another affirmative answer. "In that case, Jin drop the anchor. Johnny and Yosuke furl the sails." Once those tasks were done, Luffy ordered everyone to the kitchen. Once everyone was sat around the table and tucking into a delicious meal courtesy of Sanji, Princess Vivi included, Nami made an observation as she eyed Ace's tattoo. "You know, Ace, that tattoo on your arm reminds me of the one Luffy got done on his chest." Ace looked over at Luffy questioningly, only for Luffy to unbutton his shirt and show Ace his ASL tattoo, the sight of which caused a sad smile to form on Ace's face. "What's the story with that tattoo? I mean, you both have the letter S crossed out." It was Ace that was for CD to answer the question, as Luffy made no attempt to answer as he silently buttoned up his shirt once more. "It was our brother's initial." "Was?" questioned Usopp with all the sensitivity and tact of a hammer to the face. Letting out a small sigh, it was Luffy that answered this time. "Yeah, was. He died." Wanting to move on, Luffy changed the subject slightly. "Guess we know who cares about the other more. Seeing Ace's puzzled look, he added, "Well, I got yours and Sabo's initial on me, but you only got Sabo's." "TCH, what you on about? I've got yours right here." As he said this, he pointed to the C in his ASCE tattoo. Hate to break it to you, Ace, but my name begins with L, Luffy deadpanned. "Yeah, I know, but I used the initial of your nickname back from when we were kids." Hearing this, Luffy suddenly looked a little panicked, an expression that wasn't missed by anyone in the room. Sensing the opportunity for prime teasing material, it was Nami Thar asked the question that was on nearly everyone's minds. What nickname would this be? The amusement was clear in her voice. "Don't you dare, Ace, crybaby," was the simple answer from Ace. However, it was this simple answer that stunned the entire room, and as one, every member of the crew Slivway turned to Leok at their Kaotain. Their captain, who they were now seeing a new side to, as up until now they had only ever seen the strong, proud and determined Luffy they all knew and loved. "Crybaby?" Zoro asked. Hearing that question, Luffy groaned and looked at the ceiling, attempting to ignore the conversation that was now going on all around him. "Oh hell yeah, when we were kids he was the biggest crybaby ever. If he lost a fight against me or Sabo, which was every time we fought, he cried. If he got frustrated over not being able to use his devil fruit powers properly, he cried. If he got woke up too suddenly, then he cried. If he went longer than 8 hours without a meal, then yeah, you guessed it, he cried." The entire room, barring Luffy and Nami, was now attempting to hide their amusement at the thought of their captain crying like a baby as a child. Nami, however, made no effort to hide her amusement over his embarrassment. Wanting others to potentially share in his brother's embarrassment, he decided to ask what he knew would be a volatile question. "So Luffy, how many of the women aboard your ship have you slept with so far?" At Ace's not-so-innocent question, Nami immediately flushed so deeply it caught like her entire face was on fire. Luffy, on the other hand, looked indignant, and just what is that supposed to mean? Ace merely gave Luffy a deadpan look. "Lu, I know you." At Luffy's continued indignant look, he added, "Do you not remember the last 6 months before I left Dawn Island?" Now Luffy looked puzzled as he wondered where Ace was going with this question. "So I take it you don't remember what happened with that noble's daughter? You know who I mean, Heartfilia or whatever the hell it was." Luffy, upon hearing the name Heartfilia, immediately looked away and incredibly shifty. That was just a misunderstanding. Ace just looked unimpressed. You know you've always been a shit liar, Lu. You've always had the exact same tells." Ace simply stared at Luffy for just a few moments. "Well, what about when that girl Kana's crazy old man, Gildarts, chased the pair of us all over Dawn Island for nearly 2 days?" Again Luffy seemed to find a spot on the wall fascinating. "That wasn't my fault." Once again Ace looked unimpressed at Luffy. Well, what about when that red-haired armored chick showed up at Dayton's and punched a wall down just to get at you?" This time, instead of looking shifty, Luffy looked indignant and was ready to argue back. "Hey, how was I supposed to know she had freaky super strength?" The various members of the Straw Hats had different reactions to hearing this snippet into their captain's past. Jin, Johnny and Yozuku were either chuckling or snickering. Usopp looked at Luffy disapprovingly and shook his head. Since Sanji was unable to make his mind up on where to worship his captain for being so successful with the ladies, or to hate him for the exact same reason, he simply made himself busy preparing coffee for everyone. Their guest's Princess Vivi, face was bright red as she thought about everything she was hearing and her imagination ran away with her. In fact, her blush was so bad steam was starting to come out of her ears. Nami and Alvida's expression gave nothing away as they sat there stonily, and as for Zoro, well, he just looked bored. Over the following few hours, the Straw Hats heard numerous stories about both Ace and Luffy growing up that had them in stitches. Stories such when Luffy stole Dayton's underwear to use as the flag their treehouse, or when Ace turned 15 and he got incredibly drunk and tried to make a pass at Makino only to trip over a bar stool and faceplant into the bar. It was as things were beginning to wind down slightly that Luffy reminded Nami about the loot they had talked from Whiskey Peak, and she was the best person to catalog and value it. After Nami left to commence her favorite pastime of counting treasure, the various other members of the Straw Hats began to leave for bed, with Alvida dragging Vivi to the women's quarters. Luffy let out a massive yawn and stretched his arms above his head when he stood up. "Come on bro, you can kip in my cabin. It'll be just like old times." Ace nodded his head at Luffy's words and got up to follow him to the captain's cabin. It was just after dawn the next morning that the Straw Hats were sat around same table they had been last night, only this time they having breakfast. Nami, at hearing Luffy call her name, she looked up from her food and looked him in the eye. "You haven't said yet. How good was the haul we got from Whiskey Peak?" Nami grinned slightly at the thought of treasure, regardless of how small the haul may have been. "Not as great as I first thought. A little over 3 million in cash, about 4 million in gold and jewelry, as well as a few odds and ends." Luffy looked slightly disappointed at her declaration but didn't say anything. After all, nobody knew treasure as well as Nami, so if she said it was all only worth 7 million total, then that's all it was worth. Zoro, however, narrowed his eyes at Nami. "Oi, sea witch, since when have you had diamond earrings?" "Mind your own damn business," Nami retorted angrily as she threw her fore at Zoro's head. Not that it did any good, as Zoro just casually tilted his head to the side and allowed the fork to pass him by easily. As they were all eating breakfast, Ace looked around the room and thought to himself that he had only seen this kind of atmosphere and camaraderie in 2 other places. One was aboard the Moby with Pops, where everyone was family and every meal was a party. The second was Dayton's place back on Dawn Island. Even though those guys were mountain bandits, they still looked after one another like a family should, himself and Luffy included. With the meal finished, Ace was veer, so he and Luffy walked outside into the spot of the Mary where Ace had tied his little dinghy. However, when Luffy actually saw Ace's ship, he was floored. "Ace, what in the shit is that?" Ace knew precisely what Ho's brother was meaning, and so he answered his question as well as the unasked one. "Well, that, and he wanted to show of the cool little ship that he had and his little brother didn't. It's my skiff, Lulu. The sail bit is just to catch the wind enough to aid with steering. The power all comes from the back." With that, he pointed to the back of his little skiff where an engine of some description could be seen. "That bit there is an engine that's fueled by my own fire from my devil fruit." Luffy couldn't help it, he was jealous. Very, very jealous. "Usopp, get your ass out here." Hearing his name called in such a way, Usopp came sprinting out of the kitchen with his pistols drawn, but sagged in relief when he saw just Ace and Luffy on the deck. Holstering his pistols once more, he made his way quickly over to the pair. "Usopp, I want one," Luffy stated petulantly as he pointed to Ace's skiff. After a quick and basic explanation of how the skiff functioned, Usopp looked thoughtful as he stroked his chin. "You know, Captain, it may take some time and a fair bit of cash for the parts I'll need, but I think I can get something cobbled together just for you." Hearing this from the long-nosed teen, Luffy gave him an award-winning grin that was returned wholeheartedly. Ace gave a short laugh at his brother's antics before he gave a short wave and leaping over the side of Mary and onto his customized skiff. Moments after he landed in it, flames poured from the back of the skiff and the engine gave a loud purr before it shot off across the waves a hell of a lot faster than either Luffy or Usopp would have thought possible. TCH, now he just showing off. Luffy then turned to the rest of the crew who were just now exiting the kitchen. "Jin, unfurled the sails. Johnny, weigh the anchor. Nami, take the helm. Let's get to Little Garden." It took 6 days of sailing to reach Little Garden, and in that the Straw Hats had been attacked twice by other pirate crews as well as once by the Marines. Not that they were complaining, as each attacker was easily defeated, and with each ship they defeated, the Straw Hats robbed them blind before sinking their ship. It was because of the replenishment to their supplies that they got from the sunk ships that the Straw Hats were able to party every night without worry of running out of food. They were also able to add roughly 5 million belly to the treasury, and it was this that broke Nami out of the foul mood she had been in over the last several days. "Land dead ahead, Captain," Jin shouted down from his spot in the crow's nest. The rest of the crew gathered at the side of the ship to get a look at the island they were rapidly approaching. "TCH, guess the name Little Garden's ironic then, Captain," Zoro stated sardonically as from their spot on the Mary they could all see the giant looming trees on the island. Scanning the island quickly, Luffy pointed to a spot. "Oh, the island. Nami, take us up that river." "Aye aye, Captain," Nami said as she steered the ship towards the spot Luffy pointed out and then began to sail up the river. As they sailed up the river, the Straw Hats could only stare in awe at the size of the trees that made up the jungle of Little Garden. However, it was when several loud growls could be heard coming from within the jungle that some of the crew began to freak out. A moment later, a tiger several times larger than a normal tiger emerged from the trees and approached the shoreline. Luffy let out a low whistle of appreciation. I've seen bigger back home but still. That's pretty big. The rest of the crew could only look at Luffy in disbelief. They were broken out of their disbelief when the tiger, which was now by the riverbank, let out a low groan and collapsed to the floor with a big chunk of its back missing. "What the hell happened to it?" yelled Yozuku in worry. Usopp with his sharp eyes and attention to detail looked at the tiger's back and pieced together what had happened to it. "Look there at its back. Those are teeth marks. Whatever did that to that tiger must have been massive." The thought of an even bigger predator on the island that could take down a tiger bigger than any most of them had ever seen had them nervous. "Nami, stop the ship here. Sanji, prepare me a pirate lunchbox. I'm gonna have a look around the island." Sanji gave a nod and turned to leave and prepare his captain a lunchbox filled with nothing but meat. Nami, however, just screeched at him. "Have you gone completely tonto? That jungle's filled with nothing but monsters. How can you go wandering about in it?" Luffy was unperturbed by this and just shrugged and waved away her concerns. "We're stuck here till the log pose resets, aren't we? So might as well have a bit of a shufti round the island and find out what we're dealing with." Nami, despite the fact she couldn't refute anything he had just, still couldn't believe he wanted to wander around the island filled with monsters. Before she continued to argue with her captain, Vivi spoke up. Luffy, would it be okay if I was to accompany you out there?" At seeing the looks of disbelief directed her way by a few members of the crew, she continued. "It would really take my mind of what's going on back in Alabasta." Hearing her reasoning and seeing no reason to deny her since he'd be with her anyway and could therefore keep her safe, Luffy just nodded. "Oi Sanji. Make that 2 pirate lunchboxes." When Sanji returned and handed the lunchboxes over to Luffy and Vivi, after telling Vivi he put all his love for her into hers, Luffy asked, "You bringing your duck with you?" At Luffy's question, Karoo let out several loud and dramatic quacks and waved his wings in front of him. This caused several crew members to chuckle, more for the fact that a duck had more common sense not to walk around the dangerous island than their captain. "Come on, let's go." And with that said, Luffy threw Vivi over his shoulder in a fireman's lift and jumped over the side of the Mary and onto the riverbank. Due to the position she was in as well as the placement of Luffy's hand, which happened to be resting on her shapely rear, Vivi couldn't help but turn crimson. With the captain absent, Alvida went to the women's quarters to perform her duties as quartermaster by preparing lists of everything the ship and crew needs when the next make port at island with an actual civilization. Zoro and Sanji got into an argument over who could hunt RHE biggest animal, and so they went their separate ways, with Jin going with Sanji and Zoro being followed by both Johnny and Yozuku. Nami and Usopp, however, still had a slight cowardly streak still, and it only took them one look at each other for them to both come to the decision to stay on the ship where it was safe. Luffy had been walking for about 10 minutes before Vivi's whining about being put down finally got to him. Setting her down and grinning at her still beetroot face, he set of walking aimlessly once more. It wasn't long before the duo got their next surprise of the island, as when they passed through a tree line they came out into a large clearing. A clearing that was far from empty, as it had over 24 sauropod dinosaurs. Vivi could hardly believe her eyes. This just can't be real. Dinosaurs have been extinct for millions of years. Well, obviously not. They don't look too dangerous though, they're just munching on tree leaves. As he said this, Luffy pointed to one of the sauropod that was grazing peacefully on one of trees nearby. This changed when out of nowhere a giant sword swooped down and beheaded the sauropod. Gaigyagega chuckled a loud voice. After seeing what had made such loud chuckle, Vivi immediately hid behind Luffy and tried to use him as a human shield. This was because in front of them was a giant of a man that easily towered above the massive dinosaurs. "Little humans, you guys ever dinosaur?" Both shook their heads, Luffy with far more enthusiasm and a wide grin on his face. "Well, in that case, why don't you both join me? After all, dinosaur meat is some good eating, with only sea king meat being better." An ecstatic Luffy and reluctant Vivi followed the giant, who they learned was called Dory, back to his camp outside a massive cave system, with Luffy only pausing for a moment when he felt a sudden surge of murderous intent somewhere on the island. With that in mind, Luffy stretched out with his observation haki and was able to sense not just his crew but also 4 other presences that he was unfamiliar with. Once at Dory's camp, the duo watched as Dory began to roast an entire dinosaur leg over a bonfire. Once cooked, Dory sliced off a huge chunk of meat and dropped it in front of Luffy and Vivi. Wasting no time, Luffy immediately began tearing chunks of meat off and stuffing his face. "Whoa, you were right. Dino meant is really good," said Luffy in between great big mouthfuls of food, only stopping once in while to listen to Dory's tale of why he and his friend Brogy are on this island. The duo soon covered that Dory and Brogy have been on Little Garden for over a century, fighting to the death every time a certain volcano goes off, and over the course of the century they have fought and tied over 76,000 times. Vivi shook her head in disbelief that two friends could fight for so long, especially since apparently neither of them could even remember the reason why they were fighting in the first place. Being a pacifist at heart, Vivi felt very strongly that they should have attempted to sort out whatever dispute they were having through their words rather than their weapons. Having no appetite, especially after witnessing Luffy devour his food, looked up at Dory with questioning eyes. Excuse me, Mr. Dory, but how long does it take for the log pose to reset on this island?" "1 full year, Dory replied carelessly, not recognizing the nervousness the blue-haired teen was showing. Hearing Dora's answer broke Vivi's heart, as they had to wait on this island for a full year before they could once more sail towards her homeland, and by that time Crocodile will have ruined her country beyond all repair. In that moment it truly seemed there was no hope. Luffy looked up from his meat and met her eyes. "Don't worry, Vivi, I'll get you back home in time, I promise you." "But how? We're stuck on this island until THHE log pose resets." Tears were now falling from Vivi's eyes that she hastily wiped away. Luffy thought about it for a moment and an idea began to take shape in his mind. While Luffy was thinking, a volcano erupted somewhere on the island, and up and heading this, Dory stood up and drew his weapon. "That's the signal for our battle, little friends." With that, Dory began to make his way to the middle of the island, where he began to clash with Brogy, another giant who, much like Dory, was clad in Viking-style apparel. "You know, Vivi, loads of pirate have come to this island and died, haven't they?" Vivi wiped her eyes once more and gave Luffy a nod. "Well, in that case surely there must be a log pose around here somewhere on the island that's been reset to this place." Hearing a plan, no matter how far-fetched, seemed to cheer up Vivi. With nothing else to do, Luffy once more used his haki to feel out his surroundings and noticed that there was 2 individuals nearby. Not wanting to risk falling into some kind of trap, Luffy let them be for now and simply kept his senses focused on them. It wasn't long before Dory returned carrying a few barrels of sake. Gaigya, another fight and another draw. Sitting down by the bonfire, he put the barrels of sake that had been carrying down. "Brogy said he got these from some little humans just like you. Were they a guy with a ray all llyy long nose and an orange-haired spitfire by any chance?" Luffy asked, chuckling, knowing that out of the entire crew they would have likely been the only ones to stay on the ship. "Gaigya, that's exactly what Brogy said about him, all right." Dory then picked up one of the barrels of sake. Yhat in his giant hands looked like nothing more than a small cup. Wool bottoms up. As Dory raised the barrel to his lips to drink, Luffy's haki alerted him to a sudden spike of excitement from the 2 watching the group nearby. Connecting the sudden excitement to Dory about to drink from the barrel, Luffy shouted out, "Don't drink that." As Dory began to set the barrel down, Luffy explained his suspicions and what he had felt on the island. "Do you think Baroque works could have tracked us to Little Garden?" Vivi questioned Luffy. Luffy's only response was to give a slow, grim nod. Before anything else could be said, the volcano went off once again, so Dory got up to meet his friend in battle. "Don't you worry, Dory, me and my crew will deal with these intruders. We won't let them interfere with your sacred duel." Dory nodded his head in thanks and continued on his way. Once he had left, the 2 presences that Luffy had been keeping an eye on made themselves known. Furious at their plan not succeeding, the Mr. 5 pair immediately began their assault on Vivi and Luffy. Miss Valentine leapt over 100 feet into the air thanks to her devil fruit abilities, while Mr. 5 pulled out a revolver from inside his jacket. Opening the chamber, he blew into it before he prepared to fire. Thinking quickly, Luffy turned into lightning and appeared directly in front of Mr. 5 before grabbing him by the scruff of the neck and his belt. Quickly spinning in a circle several times to build up enough momentum, he launched Mr. 5 at his partner, who was descending at a rapid speed on a collision course for Vivi. Luffy's aim was true, and he not only knocked her off course, but the collision caused Mr. 5 to break his nose. Thanks to Mr. 5's devil fruit, as soon as his blood connected with Miss Valentine, it caused an explosion that knocked them both out. Approaching where the two assassins had fallen, Luffy looked them both over and came to the conclusion that out of two of them Mr. 5 was definitely more dangerous. Turning his hand into lightning and put his hand straight through the chest of Mr. 5, ending his life. Vivi, go over to those trees and get me a few meters of vines. When Vivi returned with the vines a moment later, Luffy restrained Miss Valentine. Why did you kill Mr. 5 and leave her alive? We need answers and I can't get them from a corpse. But he was too dangerous to keep alive. With his devil fruit I don't even know if we could have kept him restrained. It didn't take long for Miss Valentine to come round, and upon seeing her partner dead and Luffy looming her, she readily answered all his questions. From this impromptu interrogation, Luffy learned that not only was it the Mr. 3 pair that was on the island but also their abilities. Luffy sat down on the ground to better relax in order to stretch out with his haki even more. When he did so, he smiled, as not only had he found the other assassins but also one of his crew that approaching their location. Sanji had now been wandering around this god-forsaken jungle for hours looking for a beast that the Moss Head would never be able to take down. As he moved through a tree line, he came across a secluded copse and he did a double take. Now that's not something you see every day. As Sanji lit another cigarette, he never took his eyes off the strange wax house. He began to make his way over to the strange house to investigate, only to stop when two people exited the house. One was a tall, weedy-looking man in a blue and white striped jacket and beige trousers, and his black hair styled above his head in the shape of the number 3. The girl on the other hand was wearing a pink cowboy hat, a blue shirt with white fluffy clouds on it, and a red skirt. Her red hair was tied in pigtails and she was carrying a paintbrush and palette. Sanji locked eyes with the two weirdos. His eyes never left them even when he heard the girl call the man as Mr. 3 and identify himself as a member of the Straw Hat Pirates. Hearing knew that these two were members of Baroque works and therefore needed to go down. Sanji tapped the toes of his dress shoes against the floor as he prepared to attack. The first attack, however, was taken by Mr. 3, who threw from his hand a globule of wax the size of Sanji's head at Sanji's feet. Sanji easily dodged what was in truth a somewhat clumsy attack. Eyeing the wax that was rapidly hardening on the floor, he came to a conclusion. You ate a devil fruit, didn't you? Mr. 3 laughed uproariously, having total confidence in his devil fruit and his ability to capture some no-name pirate. Indeed, I ate the wax fruit, so now I'm a waxman. Sanji merely scoffed at Mr. 3's attitude but still remained wary. After all, this weirdo still had a partner. Sadly, his partner was a girl and Sanji's gentleman code would not allow him to harm a girl. Mr. 3 wasted no more time as he once more began to throw globules of wax at Sanji. While he mainly aimed for his feet, he wasn't particularly choosy when it came to targets. A plan formed in Sanji's mind as he came up with a way to take the girl out of the fight without even having to hit her. As Sanji continued to dodge Mr. 3's attacks, he began to position himself between Mr. 3 and his partner. When he was finally between the two Baroque Works agents, his senses screamed at him, and trusting his own senses, he immediately threw himself to the side. He did this not a moment too soon, as he saw that the girl had approached him from behind with her brush outstretched as if to paint something on his back. Sadly for the Baroque Works agents, as the girl tried to paint one of her special sigils on Sanji's back, Mr. 3 had launched an attack. This meant the girl was now covered in wax that was rapidly cooling and hardening. Seeing the opportunity, Sanji dashed forwards to get into melee range of Mr. 3, dodging his attacks as he did so. When he was close enough, Sanji launched a vicious roundhouse kick at Mr. 3, only to be surprised when his attack did almost nothing. This was due to the wax that was now coating parts of Mr. 3 like a suit of armor. Now they were both in melee range. Mr. 3 attempted to attack Sanji with various weapons, all made of wax. As Sanji dodged these strikes, he launched kick after kick, yet nothing caused Mr. 3 any damage. A technique that he had been working on with Zeph came to mind, and Sanji knew precisely what he had to do. Dodging a strike from a sword made of wax, Sanji dropped to the ground, then immediately swept Mr. 3's legs out from under him before jumping back a few feet. With a little bit of distance, he had time to do what he needed to do. Raising one knee so he was now only stood on one leg, Sanji began to spin on the spot. Faster and faster he spun until he was nothing more than a blur, until he suddenly stopped, and when he did, the leg he had been spinning was glowing red. Diablo Hambi. Not wasting any time, Sanji leapt at Mr. 3, who was now getting back to his feet. Sanji's kick empowered by the heat of Diablo Hambi melted the wax and landed a solid blow on Mr. 3. Mr. 3, who even admitted himself, was not much of a fighter. His talents lay in planning and cunning executions. So when Sanji's leg melted his wax armor and connected with his side, several ribs broke and he went down and was unable to get back up. Not wanting to take any chances, Sanji stamped on the back of his head, making sure the guy was out cold. The legs Sanji had used Diablo Hambi for was in agony and his shoe was now ruined. Looking at the wax house the duo had emerged from, Sanji slowly limped his way inside it. The inside of the wax house looked like some sort of a cross between a secret hideout and a living room. He wasn't investigating for long before a nearby Den Den Mushi began to ring. Not seeing any harm in answering, Sanji picked up the receiver. "Hello, you've reached the Crap Cafe, may I take your order?" "That's enough messing around from you, Mr. 3, a voice growled out through the receiver. "Yes sir, of course sir," Sanji replied, playing along. After all, this was obviously someone from Baroque works, so there was a chance he could gain some decent intel. And if he could some decent intel that helped, then maybe Princess Vivi would let him snuggle in her bountiful chest. "Is the mission complete? Are the Straw Hats and the princess dead?" "Yes sir, I've just this moment finished dispatching the last of the pirates," Sanji responded immediately, feigning being a loyal subordinate. There was a long pause and Sanji began to worry that the owner of the voice had seen through his charade. "Good, I've dispatched the unluckies to your location. They're carrying an eternal pose for Alabasta. Make your way back to base." With that order given, the voice hung up the Den Den. Turning around, Sanji saw a sight that must have been weird even by Grand Line standards. Perched on the windowsill was an otter in a purple polka dot onesie was riding a vulture who was wearing an aviator helmet. When the two unluckies saw Sanji, they turned around and attempted to fly away, likely to inform their boss of the situation. So Sanji leapt into action. He picked up a discarded knife and fork that were both made of wax and launched them at the unluckies, hitting both of them in the neck. After searching through the bag the unluckies had with them, he found the eternal pose the voice had mentioned over the Den Den. Smiling to himself, he pocketed it and began searching for his captain to inform him of the good news. Luffy was waiting patiently by the bonfire for the duel between Dory and Brogy to end. When Dory returned, he informed Dory of everything he had sensed on the island through his haki. After Dory had got over his shock that Luffy truly did know no haki, he agreed to go get Dory and the members of Luffy's crew that were with him. Luffy then sent several bolts of lightning into the sky as a signal to the rest of his crew that were scattered about the island. He continued doing this until everyone was present. Even Zoro, who despite his terrible sense of direction can, as it turns out, head towards lightning flying into the sky every few seconds. With every member of the crew present, Luffy insisted that they had to throw a feast in celebration of kicking the ass of even more Baroque Works agents, as well as getting an eternal pose to Alabasta courtesy of Sanji. Zoro and Sanji got into a slight argument over who had the better kill, but this caused Dory and Brogy to remember what had caused their disagreement in the first place. The Straw Hats and Giants ate both dinosaurs that Zoro and Sanji had killed while they drank every drip of booze that had on the merry. As the party raged on through the night, Luffy made sure to dance with not only Nami but Alvida and Vivi as well. He couldn't afford to show favoritism after all. Johnny, Yozuku and Jin got in some kind of three-way wrestling match that had everyone laughing at their lack of coordination. While Usopp was soaking up every story of Elbaf, the land of the giants, that he could get. When morning dawned, the Straw Hats all woke up with sore heads. Well, with the exception of Zoro, who for some reason never seemed to suffer from a hangover, despite the fact that he drinks all night and sleeps all day. After a hearty breakfast courtesy of Sanji, the crew began their trek back to the Merry. After loading up all the uncooked dinosaur meat onto the ship, Luffy gave the order to begin preparations to set sail. As the Merry made its way further upstream, as it headed towards the ocean, the crew saw Dory and Brogy standing guard on either side of the river by the sea. "There's one last foe before you can leave," Dory boomed out. From the Brogy continued, "In the sea around this island is a giant sea king known as the Island Eater. It's a sea king so large its shit is often mistaken for islands." Hearing this, Nami, Zoro and Luffy stated, laughing, having heard of this sea king in one of Usopp's tales. "No matter what happens, my friends, you must sail straight forwards." Luffy nodded from his place steering. The Merry made it out onto the open ocean. The Island Eater made its appearance. The island eater was a sea king that looked like a giant goldfish. A goldfish that as the Mary sailed closer opened its mouth in preparation to swallow the ship whole in a way very reminiscent of Laboon. "Luffy, what are you doing? Adjust our course, it's gonna swallow us," Nami screeched in terror. Before Luffy could respond, Usopp did. "No, Dory and Brogy told us to sail straight, so that's what we had to do." Everyone was taken aback at this, as despite the fact that Usopp had indeed turned up over the course of their journey together, he still had a bit of a cowardly streak. Before any more could be said, the island eater closed its mouth, sealing the Mary in its mouth. As several crew members began to panic at being eaten, a force slammed into the island eater, punching a hole in its head and straight through the back. The force also sent the Mary flying through the newly created hole into safety. The Straw Hats turned around to wave goodbye to Dory and Brogy and saw the weapons the giants had been holding shatter. This caused the crew to realize it had been the giants that had saved them from their grisly fate. "Right guys, Little Garden is now behind us. We're now heading for Alabasta so we can kick some croc ass." Luffy looked over the crew on the main deck before yelling, "Now who's with me?" The cheers that answered him brought a huge grin to his face. North of Little Garden. The crew had been sailing for 2 hours and the excitement of their flight from the Sea King was only just starting to abate. "How we looking, Nami?" Luffy yelled back to Nami from his spot on the figurehead. Nami looked up from the eternal pose from her place at the helm. "We're on course, and if the weather keeps up like this we'll make good time." Luffy frowned slightly when he looked at Nami properly as he took in her flushed cheeks, sweat-soaked clothes and heavy breathing. "You okay, Nami?" Nami took a slow and deep breath as she wiped the sweat from her forehead. "Yeah, I'm just a bit tired is all. I think I'm gonna lay down for a bit." With that said, she waved over Jin and got him to take over at the helm as she made her way to her room. However, as soon as she made it down from the top deck, all her strength left her and she collapsed to the floor. "Nami!" Luffy yelled, getting the attention of the crew who were milling around on deck. Panicking slightly at seeing Nami collapse the way she did, Luffy appeared by her side in a flash of lightning and took in her appearance. Up close she looked even worse than he thought, as her sweat-soaked clothes were clinging to her skin, and with the color of her cheeks it was obvious she had some kind of fever. Wasting no time, he scooped Nami into his arms in a bridal carry and made his way to her room. "Sanji, Nami's sick. Make her some soup or whatever it is people eat when they're sick." Without even acknowledging Sanji's affirmative response, Luffy continued on his way. Worried for her new friend, Vivi followed Luffy along with Alvida, who was following just in case Luffy had any orders for her and the crew. In her room, Luffy quickly stripped Nami of her wet clothes, the sight of which embarrassed Vivi, causing her to turn round, and quickly got her in some night clothes. Tucking her in bed, Luffy's mind was working a mile a minute as he thought furiously for a way to help his friend. It was as he was sat next to Nami on her bed and gently stroking her cheek with his thumb that the answer struck him, almost as if lightning had struck his brain. "Alvida, in my cabin there's an eternal pose for Drum Kingdom. Crocus said that island is supposed to be famous for its doctors, so get that eternal pose and change our heading." "Aye aye, Captain." Alvida wasted no time in complying with Luffy's order and immediately left the room. "No, wait," despite yelling, or at least attempting to, Nami's voice was hoarse and obviously weakened. In my desk, top drawer." Luffy didn't so much as move an inch as he continued gently stroking her cheek. Only now Luffy was also gazing into Nami's eyes now that she was awake. Since Luffy was making no effort to move, Vivi went over to Nami's desk to find whatever it was Nami was asking for. Vivi soon found the object in question was a newspaper, and it only took a moment for the headline to sink in. "What? I can't believe it, over 300,000 royal soldiers have defected to the rebels. That'll shift the balance of power to 700,000 rebels against just 400,000 royalists." Despair was written across Vivi's face as plain as day. Not just that, but that newspaper is 3 days old. I didn't say anything sooner cause I didn't want to worry you." After saying this, Nami gave a hacking cough as she struggled to regain her breath. She looked Luffy directly in the eye. "We can't afford any delays. We need to get to Alabasta as soon as possible." Luffy just smiled slightly. "Nami, I'm the captain, so I decide where we go." After he said this, Nami made to argue her point some more, but Luffy cut her off. "Nami, you're really ill and we don't have a real doctor to look after you. Luffy paused a moment and Nami once again made to argue, but once again Luffy refused to let her speak. "Nami, you're my navigator. A member of my crew. A part of our family. This means you come first before anything else." Seeing that this wasn't convincing Nami, Luffy decided to change tactic. "Besides, if you think about it, it's in everyone's best interest to make sure you're at 100%. Nami looked a little confused at this last statement, so Luffy elaborated with a slight chuckle. "Sure, we can follow a log pose. It's not exactly rocket science. But none of the crew can navigate like you can. Without you navigating us to Alabasta, the trip'll take 3 times longer." It was at this point that Vivi decided to add her support to Luffy's plan of action. Waving the newspaper in the air, she said, "This doesn't matter. What matters is making sure you're okay." This declaration caused Luffy's small smile to widen. Looking into Luffy's eyes, Nami also started to smile slightly. "Got it, Captain." Luffy's hand moved from her cheek to her hand before he gave it a slight squeeze before he kissed her forehead and stood up to leave. "Just rest up." He then turned to Vivi, "Can you stay with her for me?" At seeing Vivi nod then take the spot on the bed he had previously been occupying, Luffy left to fill the crew in on the situation. Once back on the deck, he called Zoro over and instructed him to gather up the crew. When they were all assembled in front of him, he began, "Nami's really sick, so we're making a trip to Drum where all the best doctors are. Now I want us there as soon as possible, so Usopp join Alvida at the helm so she can explain how to follow the eternal pose and steer. Jin, Johnny and Yozuku, get some sleep now, cuz I want you lot to take the night shift. If we sail constantly, then hopefully we can be there as soon as possible. Usopp, you'll be taking the morning shift at the helm." "What about me, Captain? When's my turn at the helm?" Zoro asked with his arms folded. Everyone else present just looked at him as if he was stupid. Big bro Zoro, you know you ain't allowed anywhere near the helm. The last time we let you steer the ship, you got us lost cuz you followed a cloud instead of looking at a compass. TCH, whatever. I'll just head up to the crow's nest and keep an eye out for land." As Zoro was walking away, he muttered under his breath, "TCH, you make 1 or 2 lil mistakes navigating and people never let you forget it." Luffy just rolled his eyes and shook his head slightly at Zoro's lack of direction. "Sanji, when the food's ready, take Nami and Vivi's food to Nami's room." As Sanji was walking away while puffing on a cigarette, Luffy added, "And if you smoke round Nami while she's sick, I'll ram that cigarette up your ass. You got me?" That caused Sanji to quicken his pace back to the kitchen, flicking his cigarette over the side of the Mary as he did so. "You've all got your orders." With that said, Luffy turned on his heel and headed back to his cabin. After all, he didn't know how much Nami's treatment was going to cost, so he needed to know exactly how much cash he had available. It was several hours later and night had just began to fall when a knock at Luffy's door sounded. Luffy had been so lost in thought that the knock on the door had startled him somewhat. "Come in." Luffy just smiled slightly when Alvida entered his cabin. "What's up, Alvida?" "Not much, Captain. Just wanted to let you know my shift's ended and Jin's taking over at the helm." Alvida took in the sight of a tired Luffy who for the first time since she met him wasn't wearing his captain's coat. Luffy smiled slightly once more before letting out a tired sigh and rubbing his eyes. Alvida, at seeing this, frowned, then looked down at what Luffy had been examining. "Is this the ship's ledger?" At Luffy's nod, she asked the question that was on every crew member's mind. "Do you think we'll have enough to pay for treatment?" Luffy gave a quick laugh. "I don't see why not. We've got about 20 million or so in cash, then maybe 15 to 20 million in treasure." "That should be more than enough, Captain." As Alvida said this, she dropped into a chair in front of the desk Luffy was sat at. Luffy just gave a tired grin. "I know, but just had to make sure we had enough to cover it. Besides, takes my mind off what's G. I can only guess how hard it must be for you. I know the two of you are close." Yeah, we are, but it doesn't matter how close me and Nami or I do the same for any member of the crew." "I see," as Alvida said that, she looked away in disappointment. Luffy realized what Alvida was inferring and chuckled slightly. "I don't think you do." At this, Alvida's head snapped up to look Luffy straight in the eye. "Yeah, me and Nami are close, but we're not a couple or anything. In fact, I don't think I'll ever settle down." Luffy leant back in his chair and gazed at the ceiling while he gathered his thoughts and attempted to put them into words. "Have I ever told you why I want to be the Pirate King?" He looked at Alvida to see her shake her head slightly, looking confused. "It's 'cause pirates have freedom, so as the Pirate King I'll have the most freedom out of everyone." It's 'cause I want the most freedom out of everyone that I don't want to be tied down to just one person. You know, women have several words for men like you, said Alvida, a small smirk playing on her lips. Ha, I can only imagine. Ace used to give me shit over it before he left on his adventure. Alvida smiled slightly before she got up from her seat opposite Luffy. Believing she was about to leave, Luffy closed his eyes and tilted his straw hat down so it covered his face. His attempt at relaxation was interrupted when he felt Alvida's small hands on his shoulders, her thumbs kneading his tired muscles. You're so tense, Captain. Luffy could only make several unintelligible groans as Alvida worked out several days' worth of tension from his shoulders. His groans became even louder when her hands moved to his neck, and it took him several seconds to regain his senses. Wait you. Remember what I said about me not doing relationships, and all that. Never stopping her ministrations, Alvida bent slightly so her lips were next to Luffy's ear. I'm a pirate too, you know. Live life with no regrets and all that. And I don't much care what I do as long as I have fun doing it. Sensing things were heading exactly where she wanted them to, she decided to up her game. You're so tense and need to let loose, Captain. She then moved her lips so they were only a hair's breadth from his ear, her breath tickling him and causing Luffy to shiver in excitement. And just so you know, I like it rough. Luffy and Alvida woke up early the next morning in bed together. The sight of a naked Alvida in his bed got Luffy's blood pumping again, and the two were quickly all over each other once more. Sadly for the two of them, they were interrupted by Sanji walking in Luffy's cabin without knocking. Yo, breakfast is ready, shitty Captain. As soon as Sanji finished speaking, he fully took in what was occurring in the room. He froze when his gaze fell upon Alvida bent over Luffy's desk with Luffy behind her with a fistful of her hair in his hand. The shock of Sanji walking in the room without knocking and catching them in this position had caused the both of them to freeze. Luffy stared at Sanji, Alvida stared at Sanji, and Sanji just kept his gaze firmly locked on Alvida's bare breasts. Seconds ticked by with none of the occupants of the room moving so much as an inch, and it wasn't until Sanji's nose started bleeding that Luffy was shaken from his stupor. Get out! As he said that, he launched the nearest thing he could reach on his desk at Sanji. Sadly, the object he threw was Alvida's bra that had been discarded the previous night. When the bra hit Sanji in the face and did no damage whatsoever, Sanji caught it before turning his gaze back onto Alvida's chest and slowly walking backwards out of the room. "Tch funking pervert," said Luffy angrily. With the mood spoiled, Luffy set about picking up his clothes that were strewn about his cabin and getting dressed. "Come on, might as well get some breakfast." Despite being disappointed, Alvida agreed and quickly got dressed herself, and the two made their way to the kitchen. After a quick, yet satisfying breakfast, Luffy was sat in his special seat on the ship's figurehead observing the rest of the crew. Usopp was at the helm and doing a seemingly good job of keeping the ship on course despite it being his first time. The twins and Zoro were doing weight training, with Zoro lifting 4 times what the twins were. Still, at least they're putting in the effort to try, and Luffy thought to himself. Luffy knew Vivi and Sanji were keeping Nami company in her room while Alvida was busy attending to her quartermaster duties. One thing the entire crew had in common was the fact that everyone was now wrapped up warmly. Even Luffy had fastened his captain's coat instead of just having it draped across his shoulders like usual. This was due to the cold wind that had descended upon the Mary along with light snowfall. Luffy had spoken briefly with Vivi about Drum Kingdom, wanting her opinion on the island. He felt since she was a Grand Line native she may have information that they didn't. As it turned out, she did know something useful about the island. Since Drum is a winter island, the colder the weather becomes, the closer there to the island. Judging by the weather, they still had a ways to go, but Luffy was hopeful they would make it by nightfall or early the next morning. Luffy could only grin, however, as Zoro had just declared that the twins could take a 5-minute breather to rest up. The grin was due to the state the twins were in. They were both hanging off the guardrail and struggling to stand as they gulped down massive lungfuls of air. Johnny, however, frowned and squinted his eyes as he looked out at the ocean. "Hey big bro Zoro. You ever seen someone stand on the sea?" "What you on about? People can't stand." "Well, would you look at that? That definitely ain't something you see every day." Luffy turned his head to look at the sight Johnny seen. True to Johnny's word, there was a man dressed like a king's jester stood on the waves. He frowned slightly in confusion as to how this possible before stretching out with his senses before his eyes widened as he felt hundreds of auras below the surface of the sea. While Luffy had been utilizing his haki to puzzle out the mystery of the man standing on the sea, Zoro had been a rather stilted conversation with the man regarding the weather. By THR time Luffy had worked out the mystery behind the hundreds of voices below the waves. It was too late. Just as Luffy opened his mouth to warn his crew about the danger, a huge ship, easily several times larger than the Mary, erupted from beneath the waves. "Everyone get ready," Luffy barked to his crew. Immediately Usopp left his station at the helm, ran to the central mast and grabbed a rope before kicking a nearby lever that sent him hurtling up to the crow's nest at breakneck speed. The rest of the crew readied their weapons, and after Luffy looked at Johnny and Yozuku then nodded at the door to the crew's quarters, the two took up the guard at the rear. The Straw Hat Pirates didn't have to wait long for the captain of the ship to make himself known as he jumped frown onto the deck of the Mary accompanied by several guards and a dozen soldiers. The unidentified captain was of average height but was almost as wide as he was tall, with purple spiky hair sticking out from underneath a white fur coat. However, the man's main identifying feature was his massive metal jaw. He took one look around the deck of the Mary, looking at each individual before casting his eye upwards to look at their Jolly Roger. "You sure you're pirates? Your crew's a little small, ain't it?" "TCH, quality over quantity fatso," was Luffy's curt response. It was the fool dressed as a jester that responded to Luffy's comment. "Silence, peasant. You are in the presence of King Waple, the rightful king of Drum Kingdom and he who rules over the Snow Rockies." The now identified King Waple simply waved a hand over his shoulder lazily in a gesture to tell his subordinate to calm down. "We're after an eternal pose to drum. Do you have one?" Luffy stared Waple down, Givyand yard glare. "No." Waple was visibly irritated by the fact that he wasn't getting what he wanted. As he grit his teeth slightly, seeking to calm his temper, he took out a sword from his belt, an action that caused every Straw Hat's hand to grab their weapon. However, instead of making a move to attack like the Straw Hats had assumed, he took a huge bite from the sword and began to eat it. As when each and every Straw Hat that saw this all had the exact same though and in perfect unison. "What the fuck?" Only Alvida and Jin let their shock and disgust show, however, as they both flinched and grimaced in the sound of grinding metal and the thought of having to digest a sword. As he was eating the sword, Waple looked around the ship once more before his eyes settled on Alvida. "In that case we'll just take you treasure and women then." As he said that, his two subordinates began to move forwards towards Alvida only to be stopped by Jin and Zoro. In one fluid motion Zoro drew two of his swords and slashed the jester-looking subordinate before spinning on his heel, bringing his sword up and decapitating his opponent. The other subordinate was a grinning man with a long yellow fur coat, a small beard and an afro. His fighting style seemed to revolve around what seemed to be hairy boxing gloves. As Zoro was dispatching his opponent, Jin had dashed forwards and slammed one of his tonfas into the gut of his opponent. And as the man fell to his knees gasping for breath, Jin raised both tonfas down onto the man's head, completely carrying in his enemy's skull. Chess, Kuromarimo, the death of what Luffy believed to be his two strongest fighters had terrified Waple, and he was now deeply regretting setting foot on this pirate ship. He turned to run back to his ship, fully prepared to sacrifice the few soldiers that had accompanied him if he had to, only to have Luffy appear in front of him in a flash of lightning. Luffy headbutted Waple with all the force he could muster and sent him smashing into the deck of the Mary. "Guys?" Luffy looked around at his crew briefly. "Go wild." That was the only instruction Luffy gave, and all that he needed to give for the rest of the crew to dive into action. While Sanji smashed the skulls of the few soldiers on the deck of the Mary with his devastating kicks, the rest of the Straw Hats jumped aboard the enemy ship and began slaughtering any who opposed them. They were aided from a distance by Usopp, who had shouldered his rifle and was picking off enemy soldiers one at a time. The entire time Usopp was in the crow's nest picking off enemy soldiers, he was muttering his new mantra under his breath to steady his nerves. "One shot, one kill. One kill, one shot." While this was happening, Luffy stared down at Waple in disdain. This Lardarse had dared to come aboard his ship, without permission, make demands of him, then threaten to take away one of his crew, one of his family. Luffy was determined to make him pay for the threats against Alvida. So with Thar in mind, he flipped Waple over onto his back with his foot before sending a wave of lightning through Waple to wake him up. With a scream of pain, Waple came around and began to turn his head frantically from side to side as he took in the sight of his dead subordinates and soldiers. Luffy scoffed derisively and sent another wave of lightning into Waple through his foot that was still firmly planted on the Mont's chest. That was 200 volts. Again another wave of lightning was sent through Waple, 500 volts. Each time Luffy spoke he sent another wave of lightning through Waple and told him the exact voltage, and after each wave of lightning he steadily increased the voltage. By the time Luffy had reached 10,000 volts, Waple was no longer aware of anything around him, his brain having been practically cooked inside his skull. He still reacted to the waves of lightning that were still being sent through him as his body spasmed and he made whatever noise of pain he was able to make, as he had already screamed himself mute by this point. Luffy took one last at Waple, and seeing the blood coming from every orifice he sighed before picking Waple up by the smoking metal plates that made up his outfit and throwing him over the side of Thr Mary. It was only 10 minutes later when the Straw Hats returned from the enemy ship with both Jin and Alvida carrying several large chests. "Captain, we've got a good haul here," said a grinning Jin, obviously in a good mood. Luffy just smiled slightly and nodded. "Stick it down below in the vault. We'll get Nami to catalog and value it when she's better." Jin just nodded in his captain's words and followed his order. Zoro, however, didn't return to the Mary and simply standing on the guardrail of Waple's ship. "Yo Captain. There's 20 guys up here who say they're doctors and have been held prisoner by Waple." Luffy looked up to his first mate with hope in his eyes. After all, the sooner they get Nami medical attention the better. When he looked at Zoro he noticed at least 20 men and women all dressed in medical scrubs with face masks on. "What you waiting for? Bring them aboard." Once Zoro had brought the doctors aboard, Luffy then proceeded to tell them about Nami's condition, and they happily agreed to take a look at her. All they asked was that the Straw Hats take them home, which was something Luffy happily agreed to do. After giving the order to sink Waple's ship, Luffy took the helm to continue the course to Drum Kingdom. It was 2 hours later, as Luffy was manning the helm, that one of the doctors they had rescued approached him and cleared his throat to get Luffy's attention. "Excuse me." Once he saw that he had Luffy's attention he continued, "We've all had a look at your friend, and while we can determine she has a fever as a result of some form of insect bite, we cannot fathom how to cure her. The disease is simply unknown to us. However, while we cannot cure her, we can treat her and slow down the progression of the disease and alleviate some of her symptoms." Hearing that the doctors were unable to ultimately help Nami, Luffy grew seriously worried for his friend. After all, these doctors were from the world-renowned Drum Kingdom, which was famous for its doctors. All Luffy could think, if they can't save Nami, who the hell can? Seeing the look of devastation on Luffy's face, the doctor decided to give him some hope, no matter how small that hope may be. "While we cannot treat her, there may be someone in Drum Kingdom that can." Hearing this, Luffy's head snapped back up to the doctor and his eyes bore into the poor doctor. "Explain," was all he said, and it was all he needed to say, and so the doctor did. The doctor told him exactly how the 20 best doctors had been trapped by Waple and forced to work solely for him as a way to extort his people for medical care. He also told him about one doctor called Kureha who refused point blank to have anything to do with Waple's laws and simply did her own thing. He also told Luffy how her skills as a doctor were so formidable that she was still alive at the age of 140, and that some of the locals even thought her treatments were magic and had thus labeled her a witch. Hope once more blossomed in Luffy's chest at hearing the doctor's words, and he grinned. "The pin on the eternal pose is completely steady, so we should be with sight of the island pretty soon. Head below deck and get warmed up if you want." The doctor dipped his head in acknowledgement and left Luffy at the helm by himself. An hour later, Usopp called down from the crow's nest. "Land dead ahead, Captain." Luffy took out his spyglass to look at the island. "We'll be there in about 5 minutes. Head below deck and get the crew and those doctors up here. We need to move fast if we want to save Nami." Usopp wasted no time and nimbly jumped down from the crow's nest and ran to gather up the crew. Just as Luffy was pulling the ship into dock, a dock that was surrounded by cliffs on both sides, he sensed dozens of people hiding just over the ridge of the cliffs. As Jin dropped, the enessences that Luffy had just sensed jumped up from behind the ridges of the cliff, and they all trained the rifles they were holding onto the ship. It was a tall and braid-chested man in a long green coat with metal pauldrons that stepped forward and addressed the Straw Hats. "Weigh your anchor, turn around and leave." With the way in which the man gave the command, Luffy was certain this man was a military commander for this island. "Look, we've got a sick crewmate and we just want to get her some treatment," as Luffy said that he gestured to Nami, who was wrapped up in a thick winter coat and a blanket and strapped to Sanji's back. "Yeah, whatever. We've heard that before," one of the men on the cliff shouted down, with many of the other men voicing their own agreements. "Turn around and leave, you won't be asked again," as the leader of the group said that every man on the cliff cooked their gun in preparation to fire. "Look, we rescued 20 doctors from some fatars called Waple, and they said her best chance of survival is some doctor here called Kureha." Hearing the mention of the 20 doctors, many of the ambushers lowered their weapons slightly and the leader of the cliffside group looked down at the ship properly and examined everyone aboard. He then carefully considered his options and how to proceed. Turning to one of the rescued doctors, he asked, "Is what he said true?" One of the doctors stepped forwards and walked to the guardrail of the Mary before lowering his mask. "It's good to see you again, Dalton," he said with a large smile. "It is indeed true that these people rescued us and killed Waple. It is also true that they have a sick comrade that we cannot treat, and I do believe Kureha may their best chance." Recognizing the doctor, Dalton took in his words and gave the order for everyone to lower their weapons, lowering his own as he did so. "You may dock your ship here. My home is nearby in the village of Bighorn. Bring your sick friend and we'll get her out of the cold." Within minutes the Straw Hats had the ship docked and were walking alongside Dalton towards his home. Along the way the group passed an enormous gray bear, easily 12 foot tall, walking on 2 legs carrying a walking stick. "Pay it no mind, it's just a hiking bear. Just make sure you bow to it, it's only good manners after all." As Dalton said that he offered the hiking bear a bow without even breaking his stride. This was an action that all the Straw Hats emulated. Before long Dalton had escorted the Straw Hats and several of the doctors to the village of Bighorn and into his home. "Set her down there," as he said that Dalton pointed to a large sofa that would comfortably hold Nami. Turning to one of the doctors that had accompanied them, he asked, "So what's the situation with her?" "We're not sure. Her fever is unlike anything we have seen before. Near as we can tell she's not contagious as nobody else has been infected, but she's not responding to any of our treatments. All we have been able to do is slow the progress of her fever, and just before we docked her temperature was spiking at 104 degrees. At hearing that Nami wasn't contagious, Dalton was visibly relieved, as a pandemic that the doctors of Drum couldn't cure could very well kill everyone on the island. The relief he had displayed quickly turned to horror at hearing how high her temperature had reached. "That's bad, if we don't get her help soon she might not make it through the night." Luffy, who had previously been silent, simply sitting next to Nami's prone form on Dalton's sofa, suddenly spoke up. "Then where can we find this Dr. Kureha?" At this Dalton let out an audible sigh. "A year ago a small group of pirates attacked Drum Kingdom, which was the reason for your less than friendly reception at the docks. They quickly overpowered what military I was able to muster up to defend Drum, and seeing this, Waple fled his castle atop the Drum Rockies and abandoned his kingdom. After he left, Kureha moved into it." "So how do we get a hold of her then? Do you have her den number or summit?" was Luffy's follow-up question. Dalton gave a sad shake of his head. "I'm sorry, but we have no way to contact her. She simply comes down the mountain when she feels like it, treats who she feels like treating, then takes whatever she feels like in compensation for her work." Sanji took a deep drag on his cigarette and let out a lungful of smoke. "TCH, she sounds more like a pirate than a doctor." Dalton let out a mirthless chuckle at hearing that. "You're not exactly wrong there, and you aren't the first to say it, nor will you be the last." A moment of silence passed before Dalton spoke again. "The only way your friend her is gonna get treatment is if you take her to Kureha yourself." It was Zoro this time that voiced the question on everyone's minds. "And how exactly we gonna do that?" "Captain," Alvida shouted, suddenly excited. "You can get her up there, you can turn into lightning and just teleport her up there." The Straw Hats, at hearing this, all perked up, hope visible in their eyes, only to be disappointed when Luffy gave a sad shake of his head. "No can do, I don't actually teleport. I turn myself into lightning then ride along the electric currents in the air." As Luffy said this, he made a rapid zigzag motion with his hand to show exactly he moved when he was in his lightning body. "And with the way Nami is, I don't think she could handle that kind of movement." "No she can't," a despondent Vivi agreed. Everyone present in Dalton's living was silent for several moments as everyone though desperately for a way to safely get Nami to the top of the Drum Rockies. What about the cable cars? Asked one of the doctors who, up until that moment, had gone unnoticed by the rest of the group. Dalton, however, shook his head sadly. The pirates that attacked a year ago destroyed them all. Even Waple's secret escape car. Once again Dalton shook his head at their suggestion. No, the coward sabotaged it when he fled the kingdom. Sabotaged it how? He removed the power unit and took it with him. After all, no power equals no movement. At hearing this, Luffy had an idea form in his mind. So it's just that it's got no power, right? Well, I can sort that out. As he said that, he held up a hand that he proceeded to turn into lightning. The sight of this as well as his words caused the gathered crew to suddenly grin in triumph while Dalton scratched his chin thoughtfully. That should work, lad. With that confirmation, the crew of the Straw Hat Pirates began strapping Nami to Luffy's back while making sure to keep her covered so she would be warm on the trek to Kureha. I'll go with you, Captain, stated Sanji. Luffy only nodded to this and turned to Dalton with a single eyebrow raised in query. Realizing what Luffy was silently asking, Dalton spoke. About half a mile due east of this village. You need to look for a thick copse of fir trees. Come on, Sanji, time's a-wasting. Alvida, while we're here I want you to make sure we're resupplied. Zoro, I want you to keep a lookout aboard the ship. The rest of you amuse yourselves, till we get back. With that, Sanji and Luffy began jogging towards the hidden cable car they had just been informed. Captain, if there's any fighting to be done you gotta leave it to me. Understanding was clear on Luffy's face. After all, with the condition Nami was too much, jostling could kill her. The two made it to the hidden cable car quickly and Sanji unstrapped Nami so Luffy could power the car without disturbing her. It only took a few minutes before the car whirred to life and began the trek to the top of the Drum Rockies. Can't this shitty thing go any damn faster? Sanji complained as he took out another cigarette to calm his nerves. It may have only been a few months since he began sailing with the Straw Hats, but he loved and cherished each and every one of them. Even Zoro. So seeing a member of his new family in the condition Nami was currently in really shook Sanji to his core. TCH, probably, but I reckon if I put any muthing's just gonna overload. With that said, silence once more descended on the cable car as Luffy concentrated on the voltage he was putting into the engine and Sanji stared out the window at the scenery deep in thought. After what felt like an eternity, but in reality was only about half an hour, they made it to the summit of the Drum Rockies. Foregoing having Nami strapped to his back once more, Luffy simply picked her up in a princess carry. Without even needing to say a word, Sanji immediately opened the door to the cable car and the duo jogged to the castle through the now steadily falling snow. Hello. Luffy shouted the open door to the castle only to get no response. Doesn't look like anyone's in, Captain. That Dalton guy did say she goes down the mountain whenever she feels like, so she might be out. Get Nami in there out of the cold and I'll wait out here and keep an eye out for her. Luffy nodded to Sanji and carefully made his way in the castle through the open door, being careful not to disturb the door as there was a bird's nest atop it. Straight ahead in the entryway was a flight of stairs, and believing that the doors leading off from the entryway would be unused due to sub-zero temperature, he quickly made his way up several flights of stairs. By the time Luffy got to the third floor, the castle was noticeably warmer, and so Luffy began searching for a room where it would look like a doctor would treat a patient. Several minutes and more than a dozen rooms later, Luffy came upon a room with a bed and filled with medical equipment as well as dozens of jars lining the walls on shelves. The best bit about the room, however, was the roaring fire in the fireplace. Wasting no time, Luffy immediately got Nami into the bed and tucked her under the covers. Just as he got her settled, Nami seemed to come round slightly and her eyes found his. Slowly her hand came out from under the covers and she grasped his hand. Luffy just smiled at this and laced his fingers through hers before placing a kiss on her forehead. That brief moment of lucidity soon passed and Nami once more passed out, only this time with a slight smile on her face. As he waited for the doctor to show up, Luffy stared at Nami as he occasionally brushed her sweat-soaked hair from her face. In what seemed like the blink of an eye, hours had passed and the door to the room Luffy and Nami were in burst open and in walked an elderly woman with a confident swagger. It was what the woman was wearing, however, that made Luffy do a double take, as despite the fact the woman seemed to be in her 70s, she was wearing clothes you would expect to see on someone a fraction of her age. She was wearing purple leather pants with a flame motif on one leg with an open purple leather jacket and a small pink top exposing far too much of her midriff as well as showing off her belly button piercing. "Are you here chasing the secret to my eternal youth?" As the elderly woman said this, she ran a hand through her waist-length white hair and struck a pose a model would. No," Luffy drawled out. "Are you sure I'm 139 you know?" However, after she had said this, she noticed Nami and wasted no time in shoving Luffy off the bed and onto the floor to examine her new patient. Kureha spent a few seconds looking at Nami before she put a fingertip to Nami's forehead. My at temperature of 104.2. She was about to continue examining her new patient when she remembered that Luffy was still in the room on the floor. "What are you still doing in here? I've got work to do, so get out." Luffy wasted no time in escaping the room. He knew he could take her in a fight, but that woman honestly scared the hell out of him. Luffy could feel Sanji's presence just 2 rooms further down the hall, so decided to wait with him, only to stop in the doorway at the sight in front of him. As Sanji was just sitting on a chair while puffing in a cigarette, a small furry creature was carefully bandaging his fingers. The sound of Luffy opening the door caused Sanji to look up and the small furry creature to stop what he was doing to turn and look at Luffy. "Yo Captain, this here is Tony Chopper. He's that crazy old broad's apprentice." Hearing that the small creature was a doctor's apprentice, Luffy looked more closely at it. It seemed to be some kind of childlike human and reindeer hybrid if the antlers on its head were any indication. He also noticed that his appearance in the room had made the creature uncomfortable and thus wanted to set it at ease. With this in mind, he gave him a big grin, the kind that never failed to make others smile when then saw it. "Wow, you're a doctor? That's amazing. You know, we need a doctor on our crew. You should totally come join us." Amazingly, Luffy managed to get all of that out in a single breath. However, the fact that he did seem to unnerve the creature somewhat. Luffy then took a seat in a chair next to Sanji instead of looming over the creature. "So what are you anyways? You know, you kinda look like a reindeer, you know." As he said this, Luffy tilted his head slightly in thought and smiled to himself slightly. The creature seemed to shrink in on itself even further at that as he resumed bandaging Sanji's fingers that now that Luffy was closer he could tell had mild frostbite. "I'm a reindeer that ate the human fruit, turning me into this," Chopper said shyly. "That's so cool. Lucky it was you that ate it. Could you imagine how shit it would be for a human to eat the human fruit?" Just thinking about a person eating that particular devil fruit caused Luffy to start chuckling, which in turn caused Sanji to start chuckling. The more Chopper thought about what Luffy had just said, the more he found it funny, and just a few moments after the Straw Hats had started chuckling, he did so as well. With the mood lightened, Luffy once more tried to get Chopper on his crew. "You know, I know a little bit about first aid myself, and I can see you're a pro with those bandages." This praise caused Chopper to start swaying from side to side in a happy dance. "Don't praise me, you jerk." Despite his words, both Straw Hats could see that he was ecstatic at the praise. "I meant what I said, you know, we could really do with a doctor on the crew, and we came to Drum to recruit one." Luffy paused a moment to look Chopper in the eye. "I want that doctor to be you." "I can't, I'm a monster that can't be around humans," the little reindeer said sadly. Luffy started giggling that he tried to hide behind a hand. While Luffy was attempting to get himself together after the giggle fit, Sanji spoke up. "TCH. You know, we've got a few monsters on the crew already." Chopper's head snapped up to look Sanji in the eye. "Caprane here can turn into lightning. Our first mate can take on an entire island of bounty hunters single-handed. The ship's gunner, I reckon, can hit the wings of a fly from 50 feet. Let's not forget you, Sanji. After all, you're the only guy the first know that can take Alvida's mace to the head with a smile." Luffy broke in with a grin. "Basically everyone on the crew are monsters in their own way." Chopper seemed to thinking about their words. "But I've got a blue nose." Despite that fact, it was a statement. The way Chopper spoke, it sounded more like a question. Luffy just let out a loud laugh. "That nose of yours is damn cute and it suits you." Once again Luffy gave Chopper a wide Cheshire grin. "And hey, if you sail with us, you won't be the only devil fruit user on the ship. You'll be part of the exclusive Devil Fruit Club population, me, you and Alvida." Chopper speak right away. He simply thought over everything Luffy and Sanji had just said. All his life he had longed for acceptance, which he only ever found in 2 places: his father, then doctoring after his father's death. "I need to go see if doctoring needs my help. After saying that, he quickly fled the room. Luffy gave Sanji a smirk. 1,000 belly says I can get him to join the crew before we leave. TCH shitty captain. That's a sucker's bet if the FY could only laugh after all his crew knew him so well. A few hours later, Kureha walked into the room Sanji and Luffy were lounging in. You're lucky you got that girl here. When you did another day or so and she'd be dead. Luffy was uncharacteristically serious. So you know what's wrong with her? Kureha pulled a seat up to fire to join the two pirates and took a long drink from a hip flask that she had pulled from seemingly nowhere. Yeah, I know what's wrong with her. It's called the 5-day disease, cause after 5 days the patient always dies. It's caused by a bite from the Kestia, an insect the world government wiped out over a century ago, so God knows how she managed to be infected. Kureha then gave Bot Sanji and Luffy a searching look. You brats wouldn't have happened to have been playing around a prehistoric island or anything, would you? Yeah, we just came from Little Garden, said Luffy with a wince. TCH, that'd do it alright. You're just lucky I already had the cure to the Kestia bite. A predatory smile then graced Kureha's face. Now let's talk payment. Before Kureha could say anything else, Luffy spoke up. We've got every bit of treasure Waple took with him when he fled this place, including several keys which I'm guessing unlock some sort of treasure room door. Kureha grinned widely, almost as widely as Luffy typically would. Aye brat, that'll do alright. Well, what are you waiting for, go get it. Luffy, still terrified of the old woman, wasted no time in turning into lightning and getting away from her to retrieve what they had taken from Waple's ship. When Luffy handed over the treasure, Kureha hugged it to her chest in a way that reminded Luffy and Sanji of Nami. Pleasure doing business with you boys. Kureha was just walking away to stash her newly acquired treasure when Luffy remembered what he wanted to speak to her about. Oi grandma, I want to talk to you about your assist. That was as far as Luffy got before Kureha's fist came down on the tip of Luffy's head. Fist of love. Luffy keeked out from his position on the floor while Danji could only smile at the scene. After all, the exact same thing had happened to him when he met Kureha and commented on her age. Brat, I'm only 139, you know. Luffy gingerly picked himself up from the floor, rubbing his head softly. Sanji had to grudgingly respect his captain, as it had taken him a lot longer to pull himself up after one of the old bat's punches. I need a doctor on my crew and I like you assistant and I want him. You reckon he'll sail with us? Kureha let out a deep sigh and set the bags of treasure down before taking her seat once more. Following her lead, both Straw Hats took the seats they had been sat in earlier, and from there Kureha gave a brief overview of Chopper's life. How he was an outcast with other reindeer due to his blue nose. Then after he ate his devil fruit, he wasn't accepted by neither human nor reindeer. She then went on to tell the pair about how a quack named Hireluck had taken Chopper in and treated him like his own son, as well as the events that lead to the man's death. Chopper's got some deep wounds on his heart and he needs someone to help heal them, Kureha said sadly, to which Luffy nodded somberly. That's why he should sail with us. The captain goes out of his way to make sure we're all looked after and that we treat each other like family. To be honest, we're less of a crew and more of a family. Kureha was silent for several minutes as she was deep in thought. I'll speak to him, but just so you know, he's like a son to me, so if you ever hurt him I'll make sure you're infected with the worst diseases imaginable and watch as you rot from the inside out. You got me? Instead of being alarmed this threat, Luffy only grinned happily. Now your friend has another 3 days of rest and recuperation. But we need to leave soon. Luffy interrupted. Brat, my patients only leave my care when they're cured or in a body bag, you got that? Sanji agreed that they needed to leave soon as they had to get to Alabasta as soon as possible, and when saw Luffy was about to argue further, he attempted to play peacemaker. What about if Chopper joins the crew? Can't he take over her care while we sail? Sanji could see Kureha pause, and instead of dismissing his idea out of hand like he thought she may do, she seemed to be thinking about it. Look, we're sailing with Princess Vivi of Alabasta and we need to get her home as soon as possible to stop a civil war that's about to kick off any day now. Fine, but only if the brat agrees to go with you. If not, she stays till I'm satisfied she's completely cured. Hearing this, both Sanji and Luffy let out sighs of relief in perfect unison. Just a few hours later, Chopper walked into the room. I just thought you might want to know your friend is responding to Dr. Ian's medicine. She's not woken up yet, but her fever's broken. Luffy grinned widely at the small reindeer. That's awesome news. Cheers for letting us know. Just like every other time in the past, Luffy's grin that had yet to fade was infectious and Chopper was returning it, albeit shyly. "You know what me and the rest of my crew has in common?" Luffy asked Chopper before seeing Thr little reindeer shake his head. "We're all dreamers. Each and every one of us has a dream that we want to see come true." This caused Chopper to look down deep in thought as he thought back to last day with his father Hireluck and how he swore to one day find a cure to every disease in the world. Seeing this, Luffy asked, "You got a dream, Chopper?" Chopper nodded slightly before looking up at Luffy and smiling shyly at him. "Yeah, I want to make my father proud of me by finding a cure for every disease in the world." "That's a nice dream," added Sanji while giving the reindeer a small smile. "Only problem is how you gonna make that dream come true if you stay on this island." "You know, Chopper, it's my dream to be king of the pirates, and to make that dream come true I've gotta sail all across the Grand Line. Along the way me and the crew are gonna see some incredible things. Things you wouldn't possibly believe, and I'm sure there's things out there that would make your medicines better. Or maybe even let you make new medicines for diseases you don't even know of yet. But like Sanji said, you can't do that if you stay here, and I'd really like it if you'd sail with us and join us on out adventures." The sheer passion and sincerity Luffy had put into his speech had caused tears to start to fall from Chopper's eyes. Long ago he had realized deep down that to achieve his dream he would have to leave Drum Kingdom. But never in his wildest imagination would he have thought humans would be willing to take him with them. The tears of happiness soon escalated into Chopper bawling his little eyes out as he launched himself at Luffy, who caught in his arms while laughing. "Sail with me and we'll turn this world upside down." Sanji was quick to offer his congratulations on joining the crew and gave Chopper a quick pat on the back. "Hey, did that old bat tell you about the Nami?" Chopper was confused and he cast his mind back over everything the doctorine had said about her patient, however he was at a loss as to what his new captain was referring to. "She said she normally only lets people out of her clutches when they're better or when they're dead. Bit creepy if you ask me." At saying this, both Sanji and Luffy gave a full-body shudder in perfect unison. "But she also said that if you were to join up with us she'd let you take over Nami's care so we can leave when she wakes up." Despite being excited about going on adventures with his new captain, Chopper was still sad. After all, while she was overly critical and a harsh taskmaster, she was also the closest thing Chopper had ever had to a mother, and he loved her dearly. "Well, your friend should be awake by morning so we can leave then. I'll just go pack my things." With that said, Chopper jumped down from Luffy's arms to go pack all the belongings that he thought to see before going to say his goodbyes to Doctorine. However, when he entered his bedroom he saw a backpack sitting by his bed. Looking inside it, he saw it was everything he thought he would need off the top of his head. "She really does me better than I know myself," Chopper thought to himself. The next day Nami woke and Luffy informed her about everything that had happened since she passed out. She was suitably excited when Luffy told her about the king's treasure they had taken from Waple's ship, only to be horrified and depressed when learned that the treasure was the price Luffy had paid for her treatment. He then told her that Sanji had gone back down the mountain to let the others know they were going to be leaving today, as well as the fact they had another crewmate. Luffy then helped Nami to get dressed despite her protests that she was not an invalid and her claims that he just wanted a free look at her body. Once she was dressed with a thick winter fur coat on, Luffy picked her up and gave her a piggyback out of the castle. Just as they walked out of the front door, Luffy once more being careful to avoid disturbing the door and the bird's nest, Chopper came running out of the castle holding his backpack and screaming, "Quick, get in the sleigh." Luffy turned around only for him and Nami to pale at the sight of an angry Kureha running towards them brandishing a large steel axe. "You think you can just run away to play pirate, do you, brat?" Luffy had a feeling he knew what was going on. His observation haki was getting to the point he could distinguish feelings, and he wasn't picking up on any feelings of hurt or anger. With this in mind, he knew that the old bat just didn't want to do a tearful goodbye, so he grinned back at her before running to the sleigh that Chopper was starting to pull in his full reindeer form. After jumping in the sleigh and sitting Nami down next to him, he shouted to Chopper, "What you waiting for? Get us out of here. I don't want the old bat to get us." After the old bat comment, the axe Kureha had just been wielding was embedded in the sleigh next to Luffy's head after being hurled by Kureha. Luffy knew she was a little sensitive about her age, just not that sensitive. Chopper wasted no time and pulled the sleigh around the back of the castle where the descent down the Drum Rockies was not as steep. Unseen to the fleeing trio, Kureha pulled out a piece of paper from her back pocket. After she unfurled it, she was looking at Luffy's bounty poster. Just like Goal. D. Roger. All the carriers of the will of D are forces of nature. After that thought, she then began to cackle madly. Despite the amount of time it took Sanji and Luffy to get to the summit of the Drum Rockies, it only took Chopper 20 minutes to get to the village of Bighorn, then a further 5 to make it back to their ship. Stepping onto the deck of the Merry, Luffy called out to everyone. "Guys, gather round, I've got someone I want you to meet. Everyone, this is Chopper and he's our new doctor." The reaction of the crew was varied. When Zoro and Jin introduced themselves, they just gave him a small smile and a wave. Johnny and Yozuku were far more enthusiastic as They both ran forwards and shook Chopper's hands at the same time. Seeing this, Luffy could help but laugh to himself and think that even though they're not actually twins, you wouldn't know it to look at them. The most comical of The introductions, however, was, by far, Alvida, who upon seeing Chopper scooped him up into her arms and began cuddling him while rubbing her face on his. "So cute," was all she could squeal out for about a minute or so. This sight caused many of the crew to swear drop, as since they had met Alvida, many of the crew had only ever seen the stern, harsh and almost stoic side to her, so seeing her act this way was actually refreshing. "So we setting sail, Captain?" Zoro questioned from his spot near the helm. The sight of Zoro anywhere near the helm caused Luffy to panic slightly, as even he was sure that even while docked with anchor dropped, Zoro would manage to get them lost. "In a moment, I just want to do some at first." With that dade, Luffy went into his cabin only to come out a moment later, turn into lightning and flash back to Bighorn in front of Dalton's house. After knocking, Luffy waited a moment for Dalton to answer, and he didn't have to wait long. "Ah, you're back. I take it the witch has cured your friend." Luffy could only grin. "Yeah, that she did alright. I see what everyone meant when they said she's more like a pirate than a doctor, but she's good at what does, I'll give her that. Anyways, I've recruited someone from this island onto my crew, and I wanted to offer you the same thing I have for other places." Dalton was curious. After all, what could a pirate offer their island? And just what's this offer of yours? Luffy reached inside his captain's coat, and from one of the inner pockets he pulled out the object he had just retrieved from his cabin. "This here's my pirate flag. If you want, you can fly it round the island to let other pirates know you're under my protection." This offer irritated Dalton, and Luffy saw his nostrils flare in anger. "Look, you said it yourself, you were attacked a year ago by pirates, and let's face it, could happen again. Now I don't want us attacking the homeland and birthplace of one of my crewmates." This caused Dalton to pause and some of his arguments to die in his throat. Thinking rationally, he knew this could help the island, but he still wasn't completely sold on the idea. "And just what we gotta do or pay for this protection of yours, eh?" "Not at all. Like I said, this is the homeland of one of my crew, and I ain't gonna let anyone trample over it. Sides, I know you're not officially in charge of this place or AWT like that, but you care about everyone here and they respect you. Plus you did say yesterday that everyone was talking about electing you to be king to replace the Fatars." Dalton thought long and hard for several minutes while weighing up the pros and cons of Luffy's proposition. Fine, we'll fly your flag." Luffy smiled as he handed over his pirate flag before turning and beginning to leave. "Wait," Dalton called to him to get his attention once more. "Who's this doctor you recruited? You never said." After everything Chopper had said about how he had been treated on this island, Luffy didn't want to give his identity away, so he kept his answer deliberately vague. "He's Dr. Hireluke's son." Dalton's mind flashed to the moment of Hireluke's death and the creature he had seen mourning over the corpse of his father. He remembered thinking in that moment that the creature several people had seen in the past and called a monster was showing more humanity than his own king. With that memory in mind, he just smiled at Luffy. "You take care of him, you hear me?" Luffy just grinned his Cheshire grin and lazily waved his hand over his shoulder to show he'd heard him. Turning back into lightning, he flashed back onto the deck of the Mary and gave the order to set sail for Alabasta. Just as the ship was pulling out of the dock, the sound of cannon fire came from the Drum Rockies as it echoed down the island. Everyone on the ship turned to look at what had caused the noise, only to gape as the snow that was falling was pink instead of white. While the crew of the Straw Hats could only be amazed at the sight of pink snow and smile at the sight that was unheard of, even on the Grand Line, Chopper began to cry as he realized Doctorine was fulfilling Hireluke's dream. "Hull looks like sakura petals," Zoro commented as he let some of the pink snow fall onto his open palm and watched it melt. The sight of the falling pink snow was the last sight the Straw Hats had of Drum Kingdom as they sailed away to their next adventure, northeast of Drum Kingdom. The crew of the Straw Hats had been sailing for just over a day as they made their way towards Alabasta, and they had finally escaped to cold weather. After breakfast that morning, Luffy introduced Chopper to the various exercises the crew did to develop not only their own strength and fighting styles but also their haki. Chopper was having more difficulty than the rest of the crew, not only because he was new but also because fighting just wasn't in his nature. Despite his weakness for combat and not being as strong as some of the rest of the crew, he was determined to be stronger. This was so he could fight for the people who had taken him in and treated him as family if the need ever arose. Just as the crew was resting while drinking a fruit smoothie prepared by Sanji, Luffy suddenly stiffened. He quickly ran to the top deck of the Mary and looked over the stern of the ship. Stretching out his senses, he honed in on the aura he sensed a moment ago. "Guys, get us out of here." Luffy's frantic voice stilled everyone that was gathered on the deck of the Mary, as they had never seen Luffy even remotely worried about anything. "I mean to get us out of here. I don't care if everyone's gotta blow in the sails to get more wind while paddling, just get us out of here." Nami, who had rushed to helm to steer the ship into a better wind current, frowned. "What the hell's up with you? I've just sensed someone behind us and they're gaining on us." This, however, didn't answer Nami's question. "And why's that got your knickers in a twist?" Suddenly a cannonball hit the water on the port side right next to their ship, and seconds later another hit the water right behind their ship. "Hey, what the hell's going on? I didn't even hear any cannons firing," Usopp screeched without stopping rowing. "That's 'cause they didn't fire no cannons, he just threw them." At the crew's incredulous looks, Luffy realized he needed to throw his crew a bone, so he shouted down to everyone who were currently busy trying to maximize their speed. "Guys, the ship that's chasing us is my shitty Gramps." Hearing this, everyone looked surprised, only to have their jaws fully drop not even a moment later as they saw a massive, gray-haired, bulky man seemingly flying through the sky towards their ship. "Luffy, how dare you run from me, you little shit." Moments later, the large man in a Marine's uniform with Vice Admiral Pips on his coat landed on the top deck right in front of Luffy. Seconds after he landed, he threw a punch at Luffy that he dodged, albeit barely. "Ha!" Luffy shouted in triumph at having dodged. Triumph that was quickly shattered moments later when the Vice Admiral launched another pooch that this time did connect, sending Luffy crashing into the floor. "You thought you could avoid the fist of love, did you, brat?" At seeing his captain attacked, Zoro moved to intervene, and as he stepped forward with a hand on one of his swords, Alvida stopped him by putting her giant mace in his path. "I think we should stay out of this one." Zoro only looked at Alvida with a raised eyebrow in silent question. "I reckon this is just a bit of family drama is all." Zoro looked at Alvida sternly before turning his gaze to the scene on the top deck before thinking about how crazy his captain is, which in turn made him think about how crazy the rest of his family must be. With this in mind, Zoro could only agree with Alvida while he let out a snort of amusement. Just as Luffy was dragging himself to his feet, his grandfather shouted his signature move one more time. "Fist of Love." Once more, Luffy was sent face first into the floor from the punch to the top of his head. "Ow. Shit. What the hell, you shitty old fart." Sadly for Luffy, this comment earned him another Fist of Love, which left him almost seeing stars. "How dare you run off to be a pirate? You were supposed to be a strong marine like me." Luffy, who was slowly getting back onto his feet and was holding onto the railing, took a moment to pull himself together. "TCH. I blame the red-haired brat for this. If you'd never met him, I bet you would have joined the Marines." Despite receiving several Fists of Love, Luffy was able to think quickly to cut off his grandfather's typical rant. After all, he had heard variants of this particular rant several times. "What the hell do you want, shitty Gramps?" Luffy's grandfather, Garp the Fist, just gave Luffy the stink eye. "What, so I can't even come see my grandson now? What do you want?" Garp suddenly grew even more serious. "We need to talk," was all he said before he walked off the top deck, gesturing with his head for Luffy to follow him. "TCH, silly old fart thinks he can order me around on my own ship," mumbled Luffy under his breath, just quiet enough for Garp not to hear him. Nevertheless, he, along with the rest of the crew, as everyone was curious, followed Garp into the dining area of the ship. Once everyone was seated, Garp once more gave Luffy the stink eye. "What do you know about your family? And I don't mean your brothers." "TCH, what the hell's Dayton done now?" I'm being serious now, Luffy. Luffy was taken aback slightly as he had never seen his grandfather this serious. In the past, anytime he yelling at him and Ace or lecturing them, he would still have the ghost of a smirk tugging at lips, or have a hint of amusement in his voice. However, at that moment Luffy's grandfather was completely straight-faced with his arms folded. Luffy thought about what he knew about his family and he realized he actually knew nothing about them. After all, growing up with Makino and the mountain bandits with Ace as a brother, his blood family had never mattered much to him. With this in mind, Luffy could only shrug his shoulders and shake his head in answer to his grandfather's question. Garp let out a long exhale through his nose at this. He knew deep down that he should have had this conversation with his grandson years ago, but he had always put it off. Your father is Dragon the Revolutionary. The gathered Straw Hats had different reactions to this bombshell that Garp had just dropped. Sanji choked on a lungful of smoke as his cigarette fell from between his lips. Nami and Usopp screeched in shock and worry. Meanwhile, Jin and Alvida shook their heads in worry, knowing full well how much trouble this could bring the crew. The swordsman trio just sat there looking confused. They had never heard of this dragon. After all, the current affairs of the world was not really their cup of tea. Luffy was not stupid, far from it, so of course he had heard of Dragon the Revolutionary. After all, Dragon was the most wanted man in the world as he was fighting against the corruption of the world government and the celestial dragons. Luffy looked his grandfather straight in the eye. Meh. I don't see what difference it makes. He's him and I'm me, so it doesn't make much difference to me. Well, as long as he doesn't plan on getting in the way of my dream. Hearing Luffy mention his dream, Garp gritted his teeth. He had lost count the number of times Luffy had declared he was going to be the Pirate King, and no matter how many times he heard it, it would never not infuriate him. By being his son, you'll paint a target on your back. The world government will target you to get at your father. Garp let out a sigh before he continued. I've done everything I can to bury this information. Not even Senny knows about this. But Luffy, the more stunts you pull, the higher your bounty is gonna climb, and the higher your bounty gets, the more certain people are gonna look closely at you. I don't know how long I can keep this buried. The entire room was silent for a moment before a confused Nami asked the question that had been plaguing her since Garp's bombshell. So you're telling us that you, Garp, the hero of the Marines, had a son who's now the most wanted man in the world? Garp growled slightly. That brat isn't my son. But Nami couldn't even finish her sentence. Luffy's the child of my child. Still don't know what my beautiful daughter saw and had the good sense to give the brat my family name. You're hiding something, Gramps. What is it? Dragon's father was a pirate until his death 34 years ago. Garp stopped here, hoping that his answer had satisfied Luffy. Sadly for him, he was mistaken, as Luffy was more excited than ever. Really, that's so cool. So who is it? I bet he was awesome. He was awesome, wasn't he? Garp rolled his eyes and tutted as he stared down Luffy in a silent battle of wills. TCH, he was Rox D. Zebek, the pirate that tried to make himself king of the world and had to be taken down by me and Roger. Rox was a beast that had a crew of monsters. In fact, 3 of the 4 emperors were on his crew. That's so cool, Luffy shouted as he jumped out of his seat in excitement. Sadly for Luffy, the rest of the room didn't share his enthusiasm for the news, so reading the room, he quickly sat back down. Still doesn't change anything. Like I said before, he's him and I'm me, so I won't let it bother me. Garp stared long and hard at his stubborn grandson. Just be careful, brat. I'll keep this from getting out for as long as I can, but I can't protect you forever. This is why I wanted you to be a Marine. If you were a Marine, when this information got out, you'd be a high enough rank the government would just watch you closely, not hunt you. Garp hunched over slightly and once again let out a sigh before straightening back up with a broad grin on his face. So which one of you lovely ladies is gonna give me great-grandbabies? The 3 women in the room, who were all sat in the dining area next to each other, looked at one another. Before anyone could say anything, Nami caught Alvida's eye and they came to a silent agreement in that moment. She is. They both shouted in unison as they both pointed at Vivi as they threw he under the bus to avoid the crazy old man. Garp focused his gaze solely on Vivi. So who are you then? Vivi was incredibly nervous under the gaze of Garp, while she was also mentally cursing Nami and Alvida. I'm Vivi. Luffy's just taking me back home to Alabasta. Garp's grin got even wider. So you're not a pirate then? When Vivi shook her head in the negative, Garp gave a loud booming laugh and slapped the table. Send the cups and glasses that were on it to the floor. Mid-laugh however Garp froze, then tilted in head in thought. "You're not Princess Vivi of Alabasta, are you?" Garp took Vivi look of alarm as all the confirmation he needed, and in an instant he had picked Vivi up in a bear hug and was rubbing his face on hers. "This is great. My good-for-nothing grandson is going to marry a princess and give me beautiful great-grandbabies." Vivi by this time was bright red with steam practically coming out of her ears as she glared at Nami and Alvida. Luffy, seeing that none of the rest of the crew were going to help the poor girl, decided to take pity on her. "TCH. Calm down shitty Gramps, you'll give yourself a heart attack at your age. Sides it ain't like that." Hearing this, Garp began to cry crocodile tears as he set Vivi back down before he grew serious once more, the sudden change in demeanor almost giving the Straw Hats whiplash. "And do you want to tell me why you have a crown princess on board your pirate vessel?" Luffy gave his grandfather a small smile. "Basically, Crocodile is starting a civil war in Alabasta from the background to take over the throne, so me and my crew are gonna kick his ass." After saying that, he gave his grandfather a thumbs up and a full grin. A grin that Garp returned fully. "Bawahaha, that's my grandson. Listen, I shouldn't tell you this, but Captain Smoker's in Alabasta looking for you. He's a good man and a damn strong marine, so if you play your cards right he might help you out." After saying this, Garp walked out of the dining area and onto the deck of the Mary with Luffy in tow and the rest of the crew following Luffy. The crew saw the marine ship that had pulled up alongside the Mary while they were in the dining area talking. "Wait, so you aren't gonna try and arrest us or anything?" Nami asked, confused. "Bawahahaha, I haven't been given orders to bring you in, so why would I?" Luffy just rolled his eyes as that was as close as "I love you" that he would ever get from his grandfather. Luffy then looked closely at the marine ship, and on the deck he saw a mop of pink hair and he grinned. "Yo Kobe. Long time no see. Bawahaha, that's my new protege. Well, him and some blonde brat called Hippo or something. By the time I'm done with them they'll be kicking your ass up and down the Grand Line, then all the way to Impel Down. TCH whatever, silly old fart." Sadly, Luffy didn't say this as quiet as he had meant to, and Garp heard him. "Fist of love." Grab bellowed out as he punched Luffy in the head once again, sending him face first into the floor. Giving one last laugh, he jumped onto his ship and gave the orders to sail back to Marinesford. The crew of the Straw Hats could only stand there in stunned disbelief over the whirlwind of chaos that was Luffy's grandfather. Seeing that Luffy was still struggling to get to his feet after the last punch from his grandfather, Zoro stepped forwards and hauled Luffy to his feet. However, he then had to grab a hold of Luffy once again as he was so unsteady on his feet. "Your orders, Captain?" Zoro questioned, trying to get Luffy to focus and keep him conscious. What? Yeah. Nami do the steering thing, Usopp lookout, and Zoro. Everyone train. Hockey. Yeah. I'm just gonna go lay down." Luffy then began to stagger his way to his cabin, stumbling every few steps. "I think I should go look after him. He doesn't look so good," Vivi said with worry evident in her voice. Jin saw an opportunity and took it. "PSH, you just want to get started on making those great-grandbabies." When he said this, he held his hands out to the sides and was rewarded with Johnny and Yosuke high-fived him. Vivi once more turned bright red and steam came out of her ears as she waved her hands in front of her in denial as she walked backwards to follow Luffy. The rest of the crew simply laughed at either Jin's joke of Vivi's MIS for fortune. Zoro was still chuckling as he relayed Luffy's orders in a more comprehensive way and watched as everyone got to work, and he drilled the training into the rest of the crew. Their training was vital because after all they were only a few days away from Alabasta, and each and every member of the crew would need all the strength they could get. The Straw Hat Pirates had been sailing for 5 days and were now only a day or so away from Alabasta. With this in mind, Luffy decided it would be prudent to have a crew meeting to plan out their course of action. Standing in the middle of the deck, he observed Nami Zoro dodging the Bakken being swung at him by Jin. This was something that made him grin, as ever since Zoro had first unlocked his observation haki he had trained diligently until he could dodge consistently. This was evidenced by Jin's swings at Zoro's head missing every single time. Luffy then turned to see Nami swinging her own Bakken at Sanji with a big smile on her face. In Nami's mind, while this may indeed be training for her, it was the perfect stress relief, as for at least an hour a day she could wail on Sanji as much as she wanted, and then at the end he'd thank her for it. Just before Luffy was about to call it a day with training, Sanji leaned forwards just enough for the Bakken to miss his head. This was a feat he repeated again with Nami's follow-up strike. Sadly, however, his streak ended there, but it was still enough for Luffy to congratulate him. "Yo Sanji. Well done, you're the second on the crew to awaken your observation haki." Sanji grinned at this as he removed his blindfold and lit a cigarette. "Just like we did with Zoro, we need to get you using it consistently though." Sanji could nod to Luffy's words as he knew himself he needed to improve and improve quickly. The sound of a wooden sword completely shattering silenced any further comments, and everyone turned to look at the source of the noise calmly sitting on the deck. It was Jin, who was holding the handle of his wooden sword with the other pieces scattered around Zoro. Jin was confused as he looked at the handle he was holding, and he scratched his head as he wondered what had just happened. His confusion was put to rest moments later as Luffy called over to Zoro. "Ha, well done Zoro. Everyone look." Zoro was the first one out of everyone to use armament. The cigarette in Sanji's mouth fell due to his shock, and he stared open-mouthed. "How is that shitty moss head so far ahead of me?" This was a question that received no answer, however, as everyone present was focused on Zoro. "Well, since I can already do the observation most of the time, I wanted to try armament. So I kinda just focused my fighting spirit and energy on the spot he was gonna hit me." Luffy could only grin at Zoro's perfect summary of armament haki. As simple-minded as Zoro could sometimes be, it couldn't be denied that he was a martial prodigy. Luffy suspected that the training and dangerous lifestyle he had lived before the two met was what had helped Zoro develop his haki so quickly. "Right, everyone gather up, we gotta plan what we're gonna do when we get to Alabasta." "What do you mean, Luffy? I thought you were going to help end the civil war." Vivi looked genuinely broken-hearted at that moment in time. Don't you worry about that, but what I mean is, how exactly are we gonna do that?" As he said that, he sat down on the deck of the Mary and gestured for everyone to do likewise. Realization dawned on Vivi, and the relief that Luffy was still going to help save her country brought tears to her eyes. Taking a seat herself, she spoke. "Well, what we need to do is get in contact with the rebels who are based out of Yuba. When we meet up with the rebels, I can convince them to stand down and we can avert the civil war." Silence was all that greeted Vivi when she laid out her plan, and several of the Straw Hats winced at the simplicity of it. "That's your plan?" Alvida asked incredulously, only to have Luffy hold up his hand to silence her. "Vivi, I'm not usually much of a planning guy. The first just usually let my fists do the talking for me." "You can say that again," Nami said under her breath, which garnered chuckles from Zoro and Jin. Rolling his eyes in fond exasperation, Luffy continued. "But I thought since we're trying to stop a warlord from starting a civil war in your home country, you might have given it a bit more thought. But if we meet the rebels and stop the war, what more do we need to do?" Before Luffy could answer, Zoro spoke up. "How's about we start with info? How do we even know the rebels are in Yuba? You said yourself you've been undercover in Baroque works for the last 3 years, so how do we know your info isn't outdated?" Alvida spoke up next, seemingly continuing on from Zoro as if they were of one mind. "Plus it's obvious Crocodile has been planning this for years, so he's bound to have backup plans and fallbacks for the backup plans. So it's obvious we need to deal with him. Plus if you went undercover, then what's to say Crocky didn't send people undercover too with the royals and rebels? Let's face it, it makes sense, don't it?" Jin said, which was the final straw for Vivi as her faith in her plan was completely shattered. Luffy took a deep breath, and though for several moments, "Nami, you got any maps of Alabasta?" At this question Nami gave a nod and left to retrieve what Luffy had asked for. When she returned, she handed it to Luffy, who speeded out on the deck in front of him and studied it intently. "I swiped it from Whiskey Peak when I looted their treasure," Nami announced to the crew, who were looking at her wondering where the hell she had gotten the map from. "Right, this city right here is Nanahana. It's the largest city on the coast, so we'll dock there and gather whatever intel we can about the rebels." "Right, Vivi, whereabouts is the palace?" At this, Vivi leant over the map and Luffy had to try desperately hard not to stare down her top at her cleavage. "Here's Alubarna, that's the city the palace is in." Looking at the spot on the map Vivi was pointing to, Luffy had to wince. "Shit, that's gonna take ages to get there through that big-ass desert. And it needs to be done, since we can't not tell your dad about what you found out about Baroque works and that we think Croc could have spies in the palace." Vivi perked up. "However, we can send Karoo, he's a super spot-built duck. They're made to travel through the desert quickly. I can give him a letter for my father to deliver while everyone else takes care of everything else." Luffy let out a sigh of relief as it was one less thing he had to worry about, and he was about to ask his next question but was beaten to it by Zoro. Where's Crocodile gonna be? He should be here in the city of Rainbase. He's got several businesses there as well as his casino. Rainbase has basically turned into Sir Crocodile's personal kingdom. Vivi's tone turned decidedly bitter at the end of her reply to Zoro. Well, how are we gonna get to Rainbase? It's almost as far as Alubarna, just on the opposite side of the river. Usopp asked. He too now leant over the map as he studied it intently. How deep does this Sandora River go? Can we sail the Mary up it? Oh yes, the Sandora River is easily wide and deep enough for a ship like this to sail up. Luffy had now heard enough and a plan was forming in his mind. Right, so here's what we're gonna do. We're gonna dock at Nanahana, and while we're there I'm gonna have a look around a bit and explore. While I'm doing that I want Sanji and Alvida to get some desert clothes for everyone. Jin, Nami and Vivi, I want you out with the people and finding out where we can find the rebels. When we know more we can sail up the Sandora and let people off where we need to. Huh? That's actually way more detailed than I was expecting from you, shitty captain, said a surprised Sanji. This gained a round of chuckles from everyone present. TCH, I can plan when I want, I just don't need to most of the time. Right, everyone go do whatever it is you want to do for now. I'll be speaking to some of you separately about stuff. With that said, the Straw Hats went their separate ways to either run the ship or kill time in their own special ways. Zoro dragged Johnny and Yozuku to train some more while Jin and Alvida spent their time maintaining their weapons. Nami was followed by Vivi as she went to the helm to maintain their course. It was Usopp that Luffy followed as he went below deck to the workshop. Yo Usopp, I've been meanin' to ask, how's the special ammo coming along? Usopp, who had been in his own little world, had not noticed he was being followed and jumped when he heard Luffy's voice. Gah? Don't sneak up on me, dammit. Usopp's anger only caused Luffy to snicker at him. TCH, whatever. It's going go. I've already made exploding rounds as well, what I call fire shots. At this he grinned manically as he looked back at Luffy. They're special rounds that'll set whatever I shoot on fire. Ha, that's awesome, I can't wait to see it in action. Anyways, I was wondering. Luffy got no further before Usopp cut him off. I've drawn up some initial plans for that special boat of yours. She, you know me too well. Anyways, I just wanted to say this shit, I'm Alabasta, is gonna be dangerous, so I don't want you worried about going for the kill if you have to. You just do what you have to keep yourself safe, yeah. You don't have to worry about me, Captain. Usopp knew what Luffy was saying, and despite his nerves he gave Luffy a thumbs up before he went into the workshop of the ship. When Luffy emerged back onto the deck of the Mary he frowned slightly. After a casual observation of the deck, Luffy stuck his over the side of the Mary and winced slightly. The rapid weather changes and rough seas of the Grand Line had caused far more damage to the ship than he had realized. With this in mind he added getting the ship repaired to his mental to-do list for Alabasta. Oi Luffy, called Nami from. Luffy looked up at her, and when Nami saw she had his undivided attention she continued. When we raided that King Waple's ship and stole all his stuff we managed to get our hands on this. As Nami said this she held up a thick book which she then threw down to Luffy. It's the complete Devil Fruit Encyclopedia written by Dr. Vegapunk. Luffy realized immediately what Nami was getting at with this. After all, they had a devil fruit sitting in his cabin. After a few minutes of flicking through the book, Luffy had finally matched the devil fruit they had to the correct picture in the book. Hey guys, I found it, Luffy called out excitedly, getting the entire crew's attention. Everyone, even the ones that had no interest in eating the fruit or couldn't eat it, gathered round eager to know about the mysterious fruit. It's called the Sun fruit. As he said this he passed the book to Jin before gesturing for him to read it, then pass it on. Apparently it's a paramecia that increases the user's strength, speed, stamina and constitution with the rising of the sun, so the closer it is to noon the stronger and faster the user gets, and at noon for exactly 1 minute the user will be all but invincible. Luffy waited a moment for everyone to have read the book. So who wants to eat it? Nah, I think I'll pass. I'm a sniper so it won't really help me as much as it would someone else, said Usopp as he shook his head. I'll have to pass as well, Captain. Ever since I saw one of those encyclopedias when I was a kid, there's only been one fruit women's bath that I want to eat, women's bath. I knew as soon as I saw that fruit women's bath that it would be a power women's bath that I would use for good and noble women's bath purposes, women's bath. Every time Sanji said the words women's bath his head would flick to the left, making him look deranged. The entire crew could only stare at Sanji incredulously, as it seemed that he didn't even realize he was saying the words women's bath. TCH, always knew he was a pervert, but that takes the piss, grunted Zoro. Nami, however, was nowhere near as calm with her disgust as she punched Sanji on the top of his head. "You're never eating that fruit, you got that?" Seeing that Sanji was about to argue, Alvida brought her mace down on Sanji's head, dropping him to his knees. "Never." Luffy took pity on Sanji after his heartbroken face. "Don't worry, Sanji, after all you can just peep on women's baths without the devil fruit." This cheered Sanji up and he gave his Luffy a large smile. "Don't encourage him," shouted both Nami and Alvida, which only caused Luffy to chuckle. Wanting to get the conversation back on track, he turned to Johnny and Yozuku and raised a single eyebrow in question. The two looked at each other and seemingly had a silent conversation with one another. Finally, after several long moments, they turned back to Luffy. "Nah, we're a team," said Johnny. "And we can't have one of us far stronger than the other," finished Yozuku, causing Luffy to nod his head at them. "Well, if nobody else wants it, I wouldn't mind eating it," said Jin. After seeing that nobody objected, Luffy went and retrieved the devil fruit from his cabin. Handing the fruit over to Jin, Luffy had to suppress a small smirk as a small prank came to mind. "Here you go." Luffy watched as Jin slowly brought the fruit to his mouth and took a bite. As soon as the fruit hit his tongue, Jin grimaced in disgust as he choked down the mouthful of devil fruit. "Gah. That's gotta be the worst thing I've ever eaten." "Don't forget, Jin, you gotta eat the whole thing for it to work," said Luffy as he fought against the smirk that was tugging at his lips. Jin frowned down at the fruit and tried not to vomit at the thought of taking another bite as he brought the fruit back to his lips. He was saved from this fate, however, by Alvida. "I think you're mistaken, Captain. It only takes a single bite." Hearing this, Jin gave Luffy the stink eye as he threw the rest of the devil fruit over the side of the ship and returned to what he had previously been doing. Just as the rest of the crew began to disperse, the Mary began sailing through dense steam radiating from the sea. Chopper, who had run to edge of the Mary to look at the new sight. "Wow, what is this?" It was Nami that answered him as she steered the ship. It's steam produced by the heat from the underwater volcanoes. Chopper had literal stars in his eyes as he vibrated with excitement. "Wow, so there's even volcanoes underwater." Nami could only chuckle slightly at Chopper's childlike enthusiasm. "Yeah. In fact, there's more volcanoes under the sea than there is on land." "Wow. That's amazing. And to think I never would have seen any of this if I'd never left Drum with you guys." Unseen by the Straw Hats, a ship passed by them incredibly closely, however, it went unnoticed due to the thick steam. "Guys, do you hear anything?" Jin asked, suddenly alert. Help me please. I can't swim, I'm a hammer." Hearing the voice that nobody on the ship recognized, everyone ran over to the starboard side of the ship and peered over the side. Jin and Zoro wasted no time in throwing the rope down to the man and hauling onto the ship. The entire crew could only stare at the man in shock as he was wearing a long pink coat trimmed with white fur, a blue-striped medieval outfit that exposed his incredibly hairy legs. On his back were two swan figurines that extended past his shoulders. When he looked up to thank them, they all saw that he was wearing green eyeshadow and red lipstick. "Phew, thanks for the save. If you guys hadn't rescued me, I'd have died for sure." "How comes you can't swim anyways?" Usopp questioned the newcomer. "Ah, you see," as he said, Spokey stood up and balanced on his left foot's tiptoes and began to spin on the spot. "The thing is, I ate a devil fruit. So if I fall in the water, I'll just sink." Even while he spoke, he never stopped spinning. "Cool, what devil fruit did you eat?" asked Luffy. This question got the man to stop spinning. "Ah, where are my manners? I haven't even introduced myself. I am Bon Clay, Okama extraordinaire, and I ate the clone fruit. Here, let me show you." Having said that, he slapped Usopp, who was the nearest Straw Hat pirate, to himself and sent him flying back several feet. The rest of the crew immediately began drawing their weapons at what they felt was a hostile action. "No, wait, that's just how my power works, look." Having said that, he then touched his face with the hand he just slapped Usopp with and immediately transformed into a carbon copy of Usopp. "See, with my right hand I can copy a person, and with my left I turn back into me." As he said that, he touched his face with his left hand and retook his original appearance. Luffy, Chopper and Usopp were all excited at this ability, all called to see more. "Oh, I couldn't possibly do more," Bon Clay said, sounding bashful, and before anyone could argue he continued, "Oh well, if you insist." With that he quickly maneuvered around the deck, touching several of the straw hats with his right hand. "And just like this I can become any one of you. And it's not just faces I copy, but I can do bodies too." After that last comment he ripped open his clothes while wearing Nami's face and giving everyone a look at her naked body. Nami, however, was furious. "Pervert," she screamed at him as she brought her fist down on the top of Bon Clay's head in a way very reminiscent of Garp with Luffy. "And the rest of you, that'll be 100,000 belly each for the free show." The rest of the crew simply rolled their eyes at this though. "And once I've learned a face I never forget it." Bon Clay then began cycling through many of the faces he had memorized. The sight of one in particular caused Vivi to gasp slightly. "That's so cool, you should definitely join my crew," Luffy declared. "Ah, but you see I already have my own crew." Hearing this, Luffy sagged in disappointment and was about to argue further when another ship pulled up alongside the Mary. "Ah, here's my crew now." Bon Clay then jailed and looked over his shoulder at the Straw Hats and saw that several of the crew looked disappointed to see him go. "Fear not, for even though we must part now as we go our separate ways, we do so as friends." This comment earned a smile from the Straw Hats that had been sad to see him leave. Smile that quickly fell when they heard the crew welcome back Bon Clay and call him Mr. too. "Shit. Well, that ain't good," said a grim Zoro. "No, it's worse than you think. When he was cycling through all of those faces I recognized one of them. It was the face of my father." Vivi was nearly in tears as she said this. Frustration at the situation and worry for her father dominating her thoughts. Luffy, seeing this, grabbed a hold of Vivi and pulled her into a tight hug. "Don't worry, Vivi. I promised you that we'd save your country and kick Croc's ass, and that's exactly what we're gonna do." When he said this, Vivi sobbed harder, only this time in relief. The crew was silent for several moments before Alvida spoke up. This might actually be a good thing. This comment got the entire crew's attention and everyone turned to look at her. "At least we know now that Baroque Works has someone like him that can turn into other people, rather than be surprised about it later. Plus we know for a fact that Baroque Works can get close to the king. And if they can get close to the king, then they can do the same with the rebels," Nami said evenly. "Yeah, that's all well and good and all, but that guy can turn into any one of us," said Johnny. Silence once more descended on the ship as the crew thought about their predicament. Sanji, who had emerged from the kitchen with a tray of drinks just as Bon Clay was leaving, lit a cigarette. Breathing out a mouthful of smoke, he spoke up. "What we've got to do is mark ourselves in a way he doesn't know about." Hearing Sanji's idea, Usopp pulled out a pen. "We can use this permanent marker and draw a cross on our forearm. And as long as we cover it up with summit, he won't know about it." The Straw Hats all smiled at this idea, and one by one the crew drew an X on their forearm and tied a piece of fabric around their arm to hide it. Just before Luffy covered his, he stared at it while smiling. "You know, this X is like a symbol of our friendship. It's summit that links us all together. So when we're fighting in Alabasta and if things get tough, I want you guys to look at that X and remember what we're fighting for." Relief for the pirates that were saving her country flooded through Princess Vivi, and she spun around from her place in Luffy's arms so she was facing him. Throwing her arms around him, she hugged him as hard as she could before kissing him on the cheek. "Thank you, just thank you for everything." Luffy was unable to help himself as he let his hands wander slightly and he squeezed Vivi's shapely rear. This caused Vivi to turn bright red and step back as she slapped him on the arm, laughing as she did so. "How long till we reach Alabasta?" Zoro asked. Vivi turned to him and was thoughtful for a brief second. "Not long now, maybe a few hours at most." "In that case, I want everyone resting up so we're all raring to go when we dock at Nanahana," Luffy announced to the rest of the crew, and with that said the crew dispersed to rest up. Just as she was about leave, Vivi jumped when she felt Luffy grab her rear once more. "What can I say? With an ass that perfect, I just can't help myself." While Vivi once more blushed fiercely, unlike previously with Luffy's flirting, she fought back. "Who knows? Maybe when all this is over and done with, you might get more than just a quick feel," Vivi said through a grin as she walked away backwards, never once taking her eyes off Luffy. Just 3 hours later, Alabasta was in sight. However, it was not the sight of Alabasta that had gained the attention of the Straw Hats, but rather the dozens of Baroque Works ships just off the coast. "What should we do, Captain?" asked Alvida. Luffy thought for a moment. Ignore them for now. Upon seeing his crew's incredulous expressions he continued. If we attack them it'll just put all of Baroque works on alert and Crocky could move ahead with his plans. But if we sneak past them then they won't even know we're in Alabasta till it's too late. Various eyes rang out from the assembled crew and so the Mary, under Nami's careful steering, avoided the Baroque works blockade. After docking in Nanahana, Luffy sent Sanji into the town with some money to procure clothing for the rest of the crew to blend in. This however did not sit well with Nami and she made her displeasure known. You seriously sent that pervert out there by himself to buy clothes for everyone? Nami was genuinely concerned over what kind of outfit she would be forced to wear due to Sanji's perverted nature. Meh, what can I say, I'm kind of interested in seeing what he comes back with. Sides OT wasn't like I had too many options. Zoro would just get lost, Johnny and Yozuku would get distracted, me and Chopper would draw too much attention to ourselves. And let's face it, you and Usopp would take all day to get the clothes cause you'd spend all day haggling to save a single belly. Nami found that Luffy actually had a bit of a point which took the wind out of her sails somewhat. Well, what about Jin or Alvida? You could have sent them. Luffy just shrugged carelessly. Well, Alvida's hot as hell so she would have drawn too much attention to herself. It's not normally a bad thing but we're trying to be sneaky, remember. I suppose I could have sent Jin but what? Luffy knew he was getting under Nami's skin so he was now sporting a huge grin. But I wouldn't be able to see three goddesses such as you three in whatever skimpy outfit Sanji comes back with. Nami just huffed as she walked away to talk to Usopp about THR new staff he had made for her. It wasn't long before Sanji returned and just like Nami had predicted, the outfits he had bought for the girls was indeed revealing. Nevertheless, the girls still put on the skimpy belly dancer outfits and while Nami grumbled slightly about everyone getting a free eyeful, Alvida was pleased with what she was wearing. Alvida's belly dancer outfit was red while Nami's was blue and Vivi's purple. After twirling on the spot to show off slightly, Alvida called out to Luffy to get his attention before swinging her hips rhythmically in an imitation of a ballet dance. Vivi giggled slightly. Belly dancing originated in Alabasta. As she said this she too began to dance, except it was obvious her moves were far more practiced and fluid. As Vivi and Alvida danced in front of him, Luffy and Sanji couldn't tear their eyes away from the swaying of their hips. Sanji's nose even started to bleed. TCH, can your perversion shitty love cook? Sanji just glared at Zoro when he heard his comment. TCH, that's enough outta you shitty moss head. Even while arguing with Zoro, Sanji never once took his eyes off the scantily clad girls in front of him. It was also at this moment that Luffy and Sanji had their first true bro moment as Luffy, without taking his eyes off THR girls, held his fist up to Sanji who, without missing a beat, gave him a fist bump. Looking up at the sky as if praying for strength, Nami spoke up. So what's the plan of action now? Several moments passed without answer and so she cleared her throat. Another several moments passed without an answer to her query, so she took off the high-heeled shoe that came with the outfit and threw it at Luffy with all her might. This action finally got a response as he seemed to shake himself out of his stupor before grinning sheepishly. Ahem. Well, we need info about the state of things. We need to know about where Crocky is gonna be, where the rebels are, and any info about this whole civil war that you may not have heard while you were away, Vivi. Luffy paused and thought deeply for a moment. We need to send people that can be more incognito. So Jin, I want you to take Usopp, Nami and Alvida and see what you can find out. Aye, Captain. And with that the quartet made their complete the task given to them by their captain, each of them fully aware of how serious and important this task was.